was thinking though, probably, well, I guess it makes sense first to kind of talk a little bit about karma, and particularly today we're focusing on how to purify karma. Um, so I thought it makes more sense to kind of talk about that first, and then in the afternoon we'll do a bunch of practice using this little booklet. So you don't need one right now, but before the afternoon, make sure you have one, because we'll use that more the next session. But so maybe we start. So like I say, start kind of explaining this idea of purifying karma. So the first thing I want to say actually about that is this: is from a Buddhist perspective, right? What Buddhism is asserting about you, about each of us here, everybody, right, is that you, like you have Buddha nature, right? So that means that any karma can be purified. And so I just wanted to start with that before we get into how you purify karma. Is this basic idea that that any karma can be purified. And there are a number of stories in Buddhist history that I think are particularly remembered and emphasized to emphasize this point, right? So I thought to just share two of them just to kind of emphasize, because the reason why I'm sharing those is that I think oftentimes, I'll say this introductory part. I think oftentimes people in general, maybe I don't know, particularly Westerners, I think more than Tibetans, but I think Tibetans have it too. But can have this feeling like a feeling inside, like, oh well, of unworthiness, of low self-esteem, of sort of like I'm not. It's hard to feel that your basic nature is pure. We don't all always feel that way, and Buddhism is asserting that that's a wrong understanding. And actually, you'll see when we do the purification practice. I remember this once with one of my teachers early on when I was studying this practice, and he would do the Vajrasattva practice that we're going to do this afternoon. And then after doing the whole practice, called the 4 steps of that practice, he would say, "Okay, now think that you're completely purified, like that your mind is totally pure." And I remember thinking, wow, really? I only did an hour of practice. Why would I think that? There was some kind of resistance. And I was like, and then I looked at myself and I thought, wow, I'm resisting thinking something positive? That's weird. He was saying, think you're totally pure. And I was like, oh no, I'm not totally pure. I'm maybe a little bit, I'm a tiny bit more pure, right? Oh no, maybe just a tiny bit like that. And I was like, why am I thinking that? Where does that come from? And I think so, and then I realized I think all of us have a tendency, or most of us have a tendency like that, right? To that it's hard to think of yourself as, and it's hard to let go, actually, right? There's the negative things that we think about ourselves and our kind of, I don't know, our self-image and the way it's tied into negative things we've done, or negative habits we have, or negative associations we have. Actually, Tantric Buddhism in particular is saying just let go of you have to let go of all that, actually, right? That's part of the, Lama Yeshe emphasized that, right? He said he called that, what do you call it? Self-pity, self-image, something like that, right? And that that you want to hold on to that. And what the teachings on emptiness are saying is that's a complete, there's no sense in which that's real, actually. Actually, that's one, whereas that's not even, we're not even getting to emptiness yet, but if emptiness is true, then any self-image you have saying, oh, I'm not, I'm unworthy, I'm bad, whatever, I've made mistakes, it could be true and you're not supposed to deny that you made mistakes, but holding on to that as your self-image is a form of ignorance, actually. And it's grasping, in particular, right, it's grasping at some conceptual idea that has, that only is an idea. That's all it is, right? But we often become quite attached to those ideas. So anyway, I just thought to briefly share. I thought this one's interesting. So I thought to share two. So one is sort of just briefly the story of Angulimala, who lived during the time of the Buddha, and his name even, right? Anguli means finger, so finger mala, and mala is prayer beads, right? So his name meant finger prayer beads, and the reason why was that he was a practitioner. He had he was younger than the Buddha, but lived at the same time, and he came across kind of a evil teacher in India at the time. And that evil teacher told him if he killed 1,000 people, he would get enlightened. He would be liberated from samsara, which of course was an insane sociopathic idea, right? So the story goes that he went around and killed 999 people and chopped off their finger and made a mala of it and wore it around his neck. So you can imagine he was like a very frightening, like, you know, actually, like, that's worse, right? I mean, like, that's worse than the people on death row. Actually, I don't think anybody on death row has killed 999 people, you know, like, there's mass murderers, right? They don't kill that many people. Actually, because they usually get caught long before. India didn't have the FBI, I guess. But so anyway, so he had done all these, like, you know, like horrible, right? And then, so he had killed 999 people, and then the story goes that then he saw the Buddha, and he thought, oh, there's my 1,000th person to kill. And so he started following the Buddha to kill him, right? And he kept trying to, and every time he would speed up, the Buddha appeared as if he was walking in a leisurely way, but he couldn't quite catch him. Like the Buddha kept somehow outpacing him, so they're walking through the woods, and he starts running, and the Buddha is not running, but he can't catch him, right? And the guy, you know, the guy was an angry guy, right? So finally he was getting really upset that he couldn't catch his last victim, because he thought, this is going to be my big victory. And so finally he screamed like, stop! And then the Buddha turned to him and said, basically in a very gentle voice, no, you stop. And at that point the guy realized that the Buddha didn't just mean stop chasing me, he meant something else, right? And somehow, over time, the Buddha started, you know, like the guy decided not to kill the Buddha, right? Decided to renounce killing. And then he started studying with the Buddha. And they say in that very lifetime, he became completely liberated from samsara through meditation, right? and through purification. So you think, like, wow, how did somebody go from being like like a horrible sociopathic mass murderer to being a saint? He became a saint in that very life. That's he's one of the, when they list the Buddha's direct disciples, he's on the list of the people who, there's some who like achieved actual liberation in that life, and then there are others who didn't quite get there, but you know, were good students. He's one of the ones who achieved full liberation in that life. And so you say, wow, in one lifetime he went from being a mass murderer who was like, can you imagine him walking around with like fingers around his neck? I mean, like complete insane person, right? Like, you know, yeah, the worst of the worst, right? But then he became a saint who taught others, you know, and taught others for years before he died, and was completely, you know, what's the word we say it, like, totally valid as a saint, right, and a monk. And so you say, well, how could that be, right? But what I think actually that the Buddha was quite pleased to have a student like that, because I think the Buddha knew. He said, oh, and I think the Buddha knew in the future there would be people, and the people would be able to say, well, I didn't do anything quite that bad, you know. So there's hope. Or something like that. Actually, it's more than hope, though, right? The Buddha saying it's totally possible. I think by the Buddha teaching Angulimala, I think the Buddha intentionally went and found him, actually, you know, like that. Partly because he wanted to help him, and partly because he knew it would help people in the future. Right? So then there's also the story of Milarepa, right? Who's like Tibet's probably the most famous yogi of Tibet. Right? And people probably some of you read the life story of Milarepa, right? But Milarepa, he was like one where his aunt and uncle his father died, his aunt and uncle stole his parents' fortune and abused him and his mom and sister, right, throughout his whole childhood. And then his mom threatened to kill herself if he didn't get even, right? And so in Tibet, you know, they were powerful and had swords and all that, and he thought, well, I can't fight them, so he went and learned black magic and somehow made a storm that knocked a roof down and killed, how many people was it? Quite a number of people. Like in the teens, I think. 15 people, I forget the exact number. But, and then, you know, and then he went and found it, you know, and then he realized he regretted what he had done, right? Whereas when he thought about it, he thought about the suffering he had caused other people. He thought about how that, you know, he saw that then the survivors of that tragedy were angry at him, he was angry at them, right? And that this was like an endless cycle of violence, that it would lead him to suffer in this life and in future lives, that it would lead them to suffer endlessly, that was a pointless, that fighting your enemies is pointless, right? So he went and found a teacher, and he became, they say, enlightened. He was one of the first Tibetans to become enlightened in one lifetime. He may have been the first Tibetan to go from being an ordinary person all the way to, other people they say it takes many lifetimes, right, where they kind of reincarnate and they're further along the path, and he reincarnated again. He went from being a killer to fully enlightened in one life. And I think Tibetans really love his story. And partly it's beautiful. His story of his devotion to his teacher and his meditation is very beautiful. But again, partly it's like, I think partly it's that we all have something of Milarepa in us, right? We all have things that, like, so say where deep down you don't feel that you know you haven't, that you know you've done negative things, let's put it that way. And that you have negative tendencies in your mind, in your body. So Milarepa had those too, but he became enlightened in one life. So the point there is that anybody can, that's the basic Buddhist teaching, right, is anything can be purified. That's one good trait of negative karma, is that it can be purified. And then I'll say also about, there'll be a little noise, I don't think they're coming. Sorry. So then also I just want to say a little bit about so Buddha nature, right? What is Buddha nature? So the idea is that, actually there are different levels of interpretation of what Buddha nature means, but in brief, in a simple way, it means that the nature of your mind is clear, knowing, and also empty of inherent existence. So if your mind is, its convention, actually I would say it this way, its conventional nature is that it's clear and knowing, and its ultimate nature is that it's empty. And so it can be purified. Right? If there's any faults, any flaws, any ignorance can be purified. I guess I just want to pause there, like, so can you imagine that? Like, is that hard to imagine? Like that you yourself, right? That's your, because what the Buddha is saying is that's your nature. Right? It's not that he's not saying that somebody else's nature, he's saying it's your nature. So is that hard to imagine or not? That your basic nature is clear and knowing, and can, and that you can realize that and be liberated from any kind of negativities, any kind of suffering, any kind of is that easy or hard to recognize? Hard. Because that's not how we usually identify, right? We usually identify with much more superficial levels of ourselves, right? Sometimes Lama Zopa Rinpoche jokes, right? He talks about, because he's literally, long ago he identified with that in himself. And so sometimes he jokes, he says, and then people are looking at their face, like, if your nose is like this, then it's upsetting, if it's like that, and if your ear looks a little like this way, then it'll be very bad, he's sort of joking, but it's like, I sort of say it, that we so identify with our bodies, with our roles, right? Like our roles in society, our roles and those are all like very, first of all, temporary, right? None of those last. And they're kind of superficial, right? I think of that, like, I remember when I was, ever spent time in a hospice, right? Then like you look and like you see like all the things that people usually identify with are so irrelevant, right? Like if two people are laying in a hospice bed, right? One says to the nurse, oh, I worked on a garbage truck during my life, and the next person over says, oh, I was a CEO of a large corporation. And you'll see, like, I remember watching the nurse go, like the person says, oh, I worked on a CEO kind of, right? Oh, that's nice. Oh, I worked on a garbage truck. Oh, that's nice. Who cares? Like, it doesn't matter. You should be polite, right? But it's like it doesn't make a speck of difference at that point, right? But actually, if the person's kind, that makes a difference, right? Whereas if the person's irritable, that makes, like, if the person's kind at that moment or irritable, that makes a difference. Not what role they play. And the same thing goes, right? Like, it's not just in a hospice, right? But in the middle of the night, if you wake up from a nightmare, does it matter what role you play? No, right? If you're alone in the middle of the night, right? What matters is what's in your heart, not, not what role, and even like friend, right? Like, oh, I have these friends. Not just like at your job, right? Like, that's good, it's important to have friends, but that's not fundamental, right? Because friends leave. Can you guys hear, or should we pause? you hear in the background? Okay, I'll pause for a few minutes.
That's awesome. My house next.
I wasn't expecting it, so I should have called.
I might as well just leave it up.
Was it coming down all because of those guys? Oh,
No.
It's
Yeah.
getting
Bigger. That's so nice of you to do that.
So I guess maybe should I try and
They'll be back.
tell you that? But so this process of purification, is about changing your behavior, for sure, but it's also about changing your self-image. That's what I'm starting with, is just sort of introducing the idea, right? Because you have to be, like, there are some people who don't want to change their behavior, right? Like, they want to keep doing some negative thing. I know that's a problem. But it's actually just as much a problem if you're not willing to let go of your self-image as a negative person. Or some part of you feeling negative. It's not that you think you're all bad necessarily, but if you're not willing to let go of whatever the self-image is, that's just as problematic as not being willing to change the behavior. Because actually, if you hold on to a self-image as somebody who does negative things, then you're going to do negative things, right? Because your mind, we already said that about karma, right? Your mind leads the karmic process. Your thoughts lead the karmic process. So changing your self-image is really important. And so I guess I just want to say a little more about that. Like, then we'll get into the actual process of how you purify karma. That'll be right there for that. But I was saying this, like, so I guess just say it this way, just focusing on just the conventional nature of your mind is clear and knowing. So what that means is that whatever thoughts you have, right? Actually, having negative thoughts proves that your mind's clear. That's one thing that's kind of interesting, right? You could think that, well, I get angry or I get filled with craving, so my mind's not clear and knowing. Right? But actually, for one of the logics, one of the ways that Buddhist teachers reflect on that is to say, well, if one moment you can be angry, and another moment you can be filled with desire, and another moment you can be sleepy, then none of those emotions is in the nature of your mind. Funny time. So I guess what I'm getting at there is this, is that if emotions can arise and pass away in your mind, then your mind is not in the nature of those emotions. Right? And if thoughts can arise and pass away in your mind, then your mind is not in the nature of any one of those thoughts. And an analogy that's given, that we've talked about before in these classes actually is like that the mind, if the mind is like the sky, that the thoughts and emotions are like clouds, right? So a storm is coming to this area, right? But that even the biggest storm can, what's the word, damage the openness of the sky, right? Actually, it's the openness of the sky that allows a storm to happen, right? If the sky were not, what's the word to say it? If the sky suddenly became solid, then a storm couldn't come into it, right? It's the openness of something that allows something to come into it. Does that make sense? So the mind is similar, right? Because your mind is open and unobstructed, thoughts can arise and pass away. So its basic nature is not any of those thoughts. Its basic nature is open and clear. So that means, particularly what I'm emphasizing here, is that means that any self-image you have can be, is by its nature temporary, is made up, actually, and can be let go of. That's all. I just want to emphasize that point. Does that make sense, Kevin?
Yeah, would you say that one more time? Just that last part.
I guess that, I'm not sure exactly how I said it, but basically, that if the mind is unobstructed, right? So that any thoughts, any feelings that arise in it are temporary and constructed, then any self-image you have is by its very nature, first of all, impermanent, but secondly, it's just constructed. It's just made up, right? It's just made up of concepts, right? And there's nothing inherently true about those concepts, right? They're just how you happen to think, right? At that given moment, and that can change, and you can change. I mean, you can change that through a process. Right? So that makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So then, I think the next thing to cover is so how do you go about purifying karma? Right? There's a process that the Buddha taught, and that's the focus for today, right? Since we're doing karma and discovering Buddhism, we'll talk about the process that the Buddha suggested if you want to purify negative karma. And so, I'll just describe the process, and then we'll just go into.
So before you do, can you
Yeah.
just give us a definition? Maybe I missed it, and I'm sorry if I can't.
Oh, it's okay.
What is your definition of karma?
Oh, good, yeah. So, first of all, karma is a Sanskrit word, right, which means action. So, in the context of Buddhism, what karma is really talking about is the cause and effect relationship of actions. That's really what it's getting at. So that's really the definition, would be the causal relationship of action. So, and really to explain a little more though, what that means really is this, is that from the Buddhist perspective, what the Buddha was basically saying is that your own actions of your body, your speech, and your mind are the causes of your happiness or unhappiness. The causes of your happiness and unhappiness are not what other people do. It's not the environment. It's not something inherently other than you. It's your own actions of body, speech, and especially mind, most importantly, especially because happiness is a mental quality. So your actions of mind are primary, but then body and speech are also important. Determine whether you're going to be happy or unhappy. And then one more thing, because actually this will get into anyway, we have to cover this for the process of karma, in terms of purification, is that, sometimes on a more, on a more behavioral level, right, we went over this in other classes, that the Buddha listed the 10 non-virtuous actions and 10 virtuous actions, for example. But actually, on a subtler level, I think it's more useful, I mean, those are useful, you have to understand those, but I think it's useful to understand I quoted Nagarjuna, the great Buddhist master, who said actions done motivated by ignorance, greed or attachment, and hatred or anger lead to suffering. Actions motivated by non-ignorance, non-aggression or non-violence, and non-attachment lead to happiness. So that mainly it's determined by the motivation. And also I'll say one other thing too, that an action can be just mental, right? So in other words, a traditional example of a negative action from Angulimala, for example, is killing, right? Where if out of anger you kill somebody, there's no doubt, there's no mystery that that's a negative action. But even just sitting there dwelling, like ruminating on hatred, would be a negative action, right? It's a negative action of your mind, right? So does that answer the question?
Thank you.
And so, and actually, that if you look at that definition and that description, especially from Nagarjuna, right, then it's also easier to understand how how negative karma can be purified, right? Because if it's grounded in negative emotions, right, and Nagarjuna actually points this out. He says, and all those other desire and hatred are grounded in ignorance, actually. And he says, so if you overcome ignorance, then all the other ones fall away of their own, naturally. In other words, because their cause is destroyed.
Are you? I'm new
Okay,
here.
it's okay.
Do you take questions?
Yeah,
Or
it's
do
fine.
you? Or is there?
No, good. Yeah, it's good. Questions are good.
Well, one of the things one of the questions I came with, and if you're going to deal with this, I'm happy to wait. Please just
Yeah.
tell me what the rules are.
That's good.
In my religion, I'm coming from the Judeo-Christian perspective, which has taught me my whole life that if you do a wrong deed, you're going to be punished for that deed, and either depending on your own beliefs, either the Lord will punish you or you will bring it upon yourself. So there are these notions of karma in our Western religions, but what attracted me to Buddhism was that the notion of karma is different there, because yes, there is a cause-effect relationship, but you can break that cycle, and that's what I wanted to ask you about, is how the perspective differs, because if you can break the cycle, then it's not true that if you do a wrong deed, that you're going to be punished for it.
Right.
That's not the Buddhist view, as I understand it, and I just wanted to ask you if you'd be willing to comment on that.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's definitely correct. And take the example. Look at the example of that Angulimala, for example, right? Like he did incredible wrong deeds, and yet because he had become what they call in Buddhism an arhat, a foe destroyer. Like he had destroyed his inner foes, let's say, right? Actually, the view was he would never suffer. Because of the force of his wisdom, he would never suffer the consequences of those negative actions, and that he would only be of use to others and help to others, not harm any longer, but also he wouldn't himself suffer. So definitely the Buddhist view, I'm just using him as an example, is that what the Buddha actually said is that the Buddhist view is that if you do negative actions, that if you don't change, then you'll suffer. If you don't do something to change that, then you will suffer there's a quote, I forget the exact words, but basically he said, but basically the meaning was that if you do negative actions, that you have the control, or you have the power to either counteract them or not counteract them. But that it's the individual's responsibility, and that the individual person, if they cultivate particularly wisdom about how to do that, can change anything actually. But then a little more, the Buddhist view of karma also definitely is that that there's nobody else who punishes you. There's not definitely in the Buddhist view there's no external being who's going to punish you or harm you for having done anything negative. It's not like a so really it's a hard thing. So really the Buddhist view on that, first of all, is definitely there's no external creator or external force or external being who keeps track of karma or any of those kind of things. It's a bit more, really it's more like, the Buddhist view is that it's more like a natural law, and that if you understand the natural law, you can work with it. So for example, I would liken it more like almost like the natural law of gravity, right? In other words, the natural law of gravity works how it works, and the better scientists understand that law, right? Then if they want to leave the atmosphere, well, they know how much force they have to use to leave the atmosphere. If they want to put a satellite around the planet, while understanding the laws of gravity, then you can put a satellite, you know at what velocity and so on. You have to sort of approach a planet in order to, so in other words, by understanding a natural law, you can then work with that natural law, and if you don't understand a certain natural law, right, then you can harm yourself in relation to that. But the more wisdom you have in relation to it, then you can actually use it to your benefit. So actually, really the Buddhist view of karma is kind of like that. That's a natural law that if people are ignorant of it, then they end up harming themselves because they don't understand how it works. And I'll just give obviously the Buddhist view is that can take place over many lifetimes, right? But I want to give a more simple example in one life. Like, there are lots of people you meet like this, right? Like, so somebody thinks that if somebody does something I don't like, I should get angry at them and tell them off, right? They think that's how I'll be happy, right? So that's the person's view, right? Now the Buddha would say, well, that's ignorant. They're not understanding the laws of natural law of karma, right? But that person doesn't know that, right? So then somebody does something they don't like and they go and shout at them, right? So the natural process, right? This is just all a natural, nobody's imposing this on them, but naturally, right? What happens? When they get angry and ruminate on their anger, first of all, they can't sleep that night, right? They're agitated, they're upset, they're not happy. Then then they shout at the other person comes and comes back the next day and is not going to be smiling, but is going to be looking at them with an unpleasant aspect, let's say, and maybe is going to retaliate to them, right? And then they'll get more angry and so on, and the process goes on, creating more and more suffering, right? So the person intends to be happy, right? Nobody, if you ask somebody, well, why'd you shout at that person? It's like, well, I thought they'd stop and everything would be better, right? But actually what it does is creates more suffering for the person. And they just don't know, right? At the time they're doing that, they're caught up in something that they don't understand. So karma's a bit like that. I mean, that's an example of karma, actually, right? And so if the person learns how to change their mind, then they change that. So definitely there's no does that make sense? So it's a natural process. In this sense, it's both an internal process, right, of what makes people happy and what doesn't in their mind, and also it's an interpersonal process, right? I don't know, does that answer the question, or is there more to it?
I just have one follow-up question.
Yeah, go ahead.
And please tell me if you're going to cover this later. I don't want to disrupt your
No, it's
sequence, but I've been going through a period of reflection on my past deeds, and it's when you go through a period of reflection like this, the experience I'm having is I've particularly focused on speech, because I think that we cause a lot of suffering through speech, and I am I'm particularly responsible for that, and so I've been reflecting on all the different ways in which I've used speech to create suffering for others, and as I did it, I had this feeling one day that I was waiting for the sword of Damocles to fall on me for all of these past wrongs, and I'm asking you, is it like that? that there will necessarily be some repercussion for these past wrongs that we've committed, or is it like that? Is it more like, well, you develop the awareness of your past wrongs, so that, which is the first step towards maybe changing your ways, and then you can actually alter the law of gravity. You can use the law. I don't know, that I was getting a little bit stuck on the law, because the law is that if you jump out of a building, you're going to crash to the ground. That's a law if you are on the earth. But the feeling I'm getting about karma is that you can actually break out of its grasp, so to speak, if you are willing to change your tendencies and your patterns.
Yeah, so definitely the view, the karmic view, and that actually, it's a good transition into the process of how to purify. Because actually, the thinking about your deeds, right, thinking about, for example, negative actions of speech, is actually one of the 4 steps to purifying it. So the key would be to do the other 3 steps in conjunction with thinking. So that's really the key would be, in other words, so definitely, in other words, the sword doesn't have to fall. If you were to not, the Buddhist view would be this though, is that if you don't you know, if the person doesn't reflect and then doesn't do a process to change, then it will. Then it certainly will. And actually, just to, even your point about the stepping out of the window, sometimes, you know, and what would happen, like oftentimes, actually I'll say this too, so the Buddhist view on that, in terms of like, this part gets complicated, but I think it's worth sharing, I think it's interesting, is in terms of the ripening of karma, which is part of what you're asking about, right? How does it ripen? Like, the Buddhist view on that is this, is that there come, sometimes in a being's existence, there comes a point where a certain karma has, is already in the process of ripening. You know, like for example, you know, I'm trying to give an example of that. Like, well, let's say, you know, let's say things start getting out of hand in some relationship, or the person starts getting a particular illness, or, you know, something happens. Buddhist view is that there is a point where, like, once something has ripened, you can't reverse that, but that before it's ripened, you can stop it from ripening by changing the pattern. And there are many examples of that. Like, and actually, that moment you were describing of sort of like realizing what you had done, if you read the life story of Milarepa, it's very similar. There comes a point in his life where he's like, you know, he's sort of been going along and he's done some negative things, and there comes this point where he says like, what have I been doing? You know, like, and can I reverse this or not? You know, like, and actually, I'll share another detail of his story, right? He reaches that point, right, where he like looks, he does that moral inventory of himself, right? And he thinks like, I've got to change this. This is really, you know, I'm going to suffer, and it's going to create a lot of problems if I don't change. And then he goes to this one teacher, actually. He goes to the first teacher, which is, I think it's funny. He goes to this one teacher, and that teacher says, you know, actually he says something like, well, just rest in the nature of your own mind, and, you know, which is not a bad teaching. You know, it's not, he wasn't saying something evil or something, but the first teacher was actually evil, right? Who taught him how to murder. But this teacher said, like, just relax. And Milarepa said, okay, relax, and then he just fell asleep. You know, and he wasn't really changing, right? He was like, he had been so anxious and stressed out that when this teacher said just relax, then he fell asleep. And then when he woke up, that teacher said, oh, I don't think we're a good fit, you know. And he said, I think you should. And then he said, well, who should I study with? And he said, so he said to Milarepa, well, there's this teacher named Marpa who's down over there, who's a different style of teacher or something. And then they say, as soon as Milarepa heard that, he felt all moved, and, you know, some connection, I don't know, and he went and studied with Marpa. And then he did the process of purification, and he went through the whole process. And I guess that's the key, though, I think, is that moment is really important, though, and that one should follow that moment, actually. The moment of that moral inventory is really important, actually, and helpful, but then one has to follow it to its end by changing. And then one can change the ripening, for sure.
That's very important to me to hear that.
No, that's for sure.
Because without that, it's a hopeless situation.
Yeah, no, I agree, right. And the Buddha, the Buddha was very clear on that anything can, you know, that if you make enough effort, then you can purify anything. And that's why I tell that story earlier about falling asleep. If you don't make effort, then of course it doesn't. It's your own, so it's an internal process of sort of doing the right effort to change, and to purify the past deed, or action, or habit, or whatever. Actually, so maybe I'll describe those four powers. Feel free to ask more questions though as we go along, but I think this will get at part of that anyway. And so I want to describe what those four powers are, what that process is. And actually, I'm going to start with the one we were just talking about, the one that you raised, actually. There are different orders you can present these in, but I think this is the most useful order. So the first of the four powers is called, the translation I like best is called intelligent regret. Right? And intelligent regret is different. I want to be clear what that is, right? Because that's not guilt, right? Whereas guilt is some kind of, guilt tends to be an identification with a negative thing, like, you know, and it's also not shame. You know what I mean? Like, in the sense, there are different meanings of those words, guilt and shame. But I want to be clear what Buddhism means by intelligent regret. Okay? What Buddhism means by intelligent regret is this, is that you have a clear understanding about something that you did and why it's negative, right? Like you have some insight into, wow, I did this and that's really going to cause suffering. It is causing suffering and it will cause suffering, and its very nature is negative, right? And then you have some understanding about it. So it's not It's not saying I'm all bad, I'm a terrible person, right? That's not intelligent regret. And also intelligent regret is not like, what's the right way to say it? You know, it's not, well, somebody told me that's bad, so I'm bad, you know, or something like that. Right? It's that you have to have some insight, right? Like, in other words, like for example, giving the example earlier from, you know, the person who, or, you know, like the person who was angry, right? In other words, if the person reaches a point where they go, wow, like, look at what I'm doing. Like, I'm making myself miserable, I'm making the people around me miserable, and that's going to continue on and on with misery, right? I've got to stop that. Like, oh, like, you know, it's like an insight, right? But the same thing can apply to, you know, behavior motivated by craving, let's say, right? The person's following a craving and following a craving thinking it's going to make them happy, and then they reach a point where they look and they see this is ruining my life, like, or this is not, or if it's not ruining my life, it's making my life worse, you know. And this is, I'm never going to get happiness doing it. If I don't change, I'm never going to be content. I'm never going to really fulfill my potential. You know, so it's some kind of insight like that, right? You know, and so whatever the action is, right, it's a recognition that it's causing suffering to myself and or others. Does that make sense? Most of the time it includes others, but not always. Sometimes it could just be yourself, right? There's most negative behaviors, if you actually analyze them, you'll see eventually it causes harm to somebody else too, but not all. There could be exceptions where it's just, you know, somebody's like sitting alone doing something that makes themselves miserable. I still think eventually it would harm others in a way, because if you're not happy, you're going to make others less happy. But so this is the first step, and actually it's the most important step to some extent, is to really analyze and look deeply, because also, like, I think there's a danger, particularly for sometimes, like with what's the word to say, but you know, sometimes also it's easy just to go, oh well, this negative action's on a list of negative actions, you know, like, you know, whatever, you know, like the Buddha said, lying is bad, I lied, that's bad. But actually that's a good start, but that's not yet intelligent regret, really, you know what I mean? You have to analyze deeper and say, well, why though? Like, what's the problem with that? Why is it, you know, how does it cause suffering? What's the long-term effect? Otherwise, it's not very deep. Does that make sense? If it's just like somebody told me it's bad, so it's bad. You see what I'm getting at there? Like, that's not really, that's better than nothing, but it's not yet the fully qualified intelligent regret. And eventually one should feel, like the goal, not should, but like the goal is to feel, well, first of all, like Milarepa felt in that story, like, oh, I've got to change. This is like, I really have to find a way to change. Or another analogy that's sometimes given in Buddhist teachings for this is they say, like, the analogy they give is this. They say, if you were in a restaurant, right, and you ordered, you know, a particular dish, right, and you were the most recent person to come in, and so they brought it to your table and you just took like a couple bites, and then suddenly you looked around and 5 other people who were eating that same dish started like, what's the word, you know, bending over with pain in their stomach and being sick, that a certain feeling would arise, right? Like, you know, I don't know how to say it, right? Wow, I really wish I hadn't eaten that. Let me get something quick, you know, to whatever, you know, get it out of my system, right? Anyways, like, anyways, I guess the reason why they give that as a physical example is it's just this recognition, wow, that's going to cause suffering, you know, and the chances you would continue eating that dish are pretty small at that point, right? You would naturally not have any inclination to want to keep eating it. So there's like a feeling, I mean, that's just to get it, it's a metaphor to get at the feeling of this, of intelligent regret. But again, the intelligent regret should be based on insight, right? It should be based on understanding and contemplation. So you have to actually think, right? You have to actually contemplate, well, why does it cause suffering? And if you're honest with yourself, early on, there should be times where you think, well, you know, they say that causes suffering, but I'm not really sure, right? And so you have to go deeper then and really contemplate it deeply to see, well, does it cause suffering or not? You know, the Buddha said it does, let's say, or somebody else said it does, but do I recognize that it causes suffering? You know, and that's where, you know, we went over in past classes some of those teachings about the results of karma and the different types of results of karma. You know, so you can study those, but you have to then contemplate. Does that make sense? You have to contemplate your own experience, and contemplate, you know, using logic, using experience, using observation, until you get to the point of really feeling intelligent regret. So does that make sense? So then, once you've generated intelligent regret, right, then that naturally leads to the second of the 4 powers, I'm calling these four powers, that's the translation, one way to translate it. So the second of the four powers is, sometimes the first one is called regret, so the second one they sometimes call it reliance. So what that means is this, is that you, in reliance, there are two parts to reliance actually. One is taking refuge. So that what that means is this, it's like Milarepa actually, I'm using him as the example, right? Like when Milarepa was, after he realized he had killed people, right, he went to look for a teacher, right? And then he was really excited to find Marpa, because Marpa was really a good teacher for him, right? And then he really put his trust in Marpa. And Marpa gave him a pretty hard time for a while, helping him purify. But he stayed with the process and trusted that Marpa was doing that to help him, and he did help. So there's a sense of taking refuge, in other words, recognizing, so actually refuge can be in a teacher, like Milarepa with Marpa, but it can also be in the Buddha, right? The Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. That's the traditional version, right? The three jewels. But it's actually like, so in this process, right, if one is doing that, or if one's doing Vajrasattva practice, Vajrasattva is a form of the Buddha, right? A visualized form of the Buddha. So you might take refuge in Vajrasattva. But anyway, so the idea is that you turn for refuge or protection to, you could just say it this way, to somebody who doesn't do the negative thing that you were doing. Somebody who has more understanding of that, right? So traditionally in Buddhism that would be the Buddha, or it could be in Buddhism Vajrasattva, or in Milarepa's case it was Marpa, right? But you turn for refuge, and actually this power, so that's part of the power of reliance, and then there's a second part, which is generating compassion. And the compassion is quite important actually, because in this process of purification, you have to first have to have compassion for yourself, right? Not wanting yourself to suffer, right? Because compassion in Buddhism is defined as the wish, a feeling of affection for someone and then wishing them not to suffer, right? So you have to start with some compassion for yourself, but then you have to expand the compassion outward, or ideally you do, and so you include in this. Actually, it's particularly important to include anyone you've harmed, right? To have a sense of compassion for them, right? Because when you did the negative action, you had a negative motivation towards either yourself or others. So here you're developing a positive motivation, right?
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
I think that what I realized was that the core of my actions has been self-cherishing.
Exactly.
And that to me, when I read about that and I came to an understanding of that the way it worked was whenever I felt that I'd been wronged, then I felt like I had to take some action, like you said in the beginning,
right.
And to when you see that the core of that is self-cherishing, that you really are you're looking for your own benefit and your own advantage in all your interactions with others. When you see that, and then you realize how much suffering that has created, then you are filled with regret. That's really what happened to me. That was how I was able to understand what my actions have caused. I saw that at the core of the core motivation for my behavior was self-cherishing, and that every time I acted out of a self-cherishing motivation, I created suffering for others. And then I started to look at, and it was very painful experiences, but I started to look at all the times that I've created suffering, and I had such a long list of things that I've done that I felt regret. Mm-hmm. And then so now I'm curious about how you can transform that.
That's perfect. That's perfect. And really, from a psychological perspective, actually it's perfect, right? Because self-cherishing and compassion are the exact opposites, right? In other words, compassion means you cherish others, and self-cherishing. So actually, in Buddhist psychology, what they actually say is that the biggest obstacle to compassion is self-cherishing, and that as you begin to cherish others and have compassion for others, then self-cherishing decreases. So they're like literally, there's an inverse proportion in those two, so that you've got it exactly. In other words, that one has to, if one wants to purify the karma, one has to, focus on cherishing others, which means decreasing self-cherishing or overcoming or destroying self-cherishing ultimately. But one starts off just decreasing it, But so So that's why actually in transforming one's karma, one has to, this is a really important point, one has to stop, pause at this point and actually meditate on compassion, actually cultivate a sense of compassion for others and a cherishing of others. Because otherwise, actually the purification won't be very powerful. Right? Actually, I mean, sometimes they say actually this is the factor, the cultivating of the compassion actually, the depth of your compassion is the main factor for how much you'll actually purify. Or so if you do the practice but you don't really develop that sense of cherishing others, you can go through the rest of the steps, but it'll be actually quite weak. Because the motivation is not very deep. And remember, motivation is the main factor, right, for a karmic, anything karmic. So actually, and Lama Zopa Rinpoche really points that out. He points out like, many times Lama Zopa Rinpoche will say that, he'll give the example of reciting like a mantra, let's say, right, to purify. So somebody, and he would say, he's often said this, he says, if you recite the mantra with self-cherishing, there's not much meaning, you know. Whereas he would give the example, he would say, you know, one person could do 100,000, sometimes he use retreats, you know, 100,000 prostrations, or 100,000 Vajrasattva mantras, or 100,000 Om Mani Padme mantras. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche points out, he says, actually, if somebody develops deep compassion for, you know, what's the word, infinite compassion, right, embracing all sentient beings, they're just sitting there, right, I mean, you can't tell, right, but they're quietly meditating, and they really develop this strong sense internally of no self-cherishing and compassion, embracing all sentient beings. And then he says, you know, then reciting one mantra actually is more powerful than that person who did 100,000 without that compassion. And he even tells a story, I wrote this story, or it struck me that, you know, the practice of tonglen, taking and giving, which can be done for purification purposes. And he had said that I forget who it was, some teacher told this one student to do tonglen practice. They were having some kind of serious health problem. And it was karmic, and they asked, can this be purified? And their teacher said, yes, that health problem can be purified. And for this particular person, they said, do tonglen practice. And so so Lama Zopa later talks to the person and said, what happened? Did you do the tonglen practice? And the person said, you know, and usually people do like tonglen many rounds, right? Of breathing in the suffering of others, breathing out compassion, you know, for hours they can do it, right? And this person said they meditated very deeply on compassion until they were completely overwhelmed and they did one tonglen. And then they were cured. But it was the depth of the feeling, right? It was like that they actually did it cherishing others and not cherishing themselves and with real motivation. So again, like that one round of tonglen by somebody who's doing it actually with no self-cherishing and deep cherishing of others is more powerful than many repetitions with where you're distracted and not very deeply feeling a cherishing of others. So actually this point about, you know, so I just want to emphasize that, right? So actually if you really want to have an effective meditation on purification, actually those two, and you said it in your own experience, like, but those two are the most important actually. So one is really generating the intelligent regret deeply, and the other is really generating a sense of compassion that's free from self-cherishing. So then, okay, so now, so if you're going through the process, right, so, and again, you can do it in different orders, but I'm just presenting it in this order, right, so if you generate the regret, intelligent regret, then you do the reliance, so you take refuge and you generate that strong sense of compassion, cherishing others, right. Then there are two more steps that one does. So the third step in this order I'm presenting in would be, they call it the power of the antidote. So that means doing a positive action to counteract the force of the negative action you did before. And actually I'm going to cover that in a minute, so I'm going to move on to the fourth and then I'll come back to that, because that one I'm going to talk about a little more in detail. But then the fourth step is restraint. So it means restraining from doing the action again. And so I want to say something about restraint though, because in terms of the oral tradition among the Tibetan lamas, is it depends what the action is, right? So if you can do restraint like for the rest of your life or something, that's great. You know, as if it's like some big action that you did. But what they say is to be careful not to lie, right? So in other words, if it's something that you do all the time, like don't say to yourself or to the Buddha or whoever, you know, as your practice, Don't say I'll never do this again if you know you're going to do it again, right? If you know you're not capable of that. So what they say is to make the restraint should be real, and it should be for a particular time. You know, like, or is that you should think carefully and honestly with yourself and say either, you know, if you could say I'll never do that again, great, that's fine. But if you can't, then say, you know what, I'm going to be really mindful, and for 24 hours or 48 hours or a week or whatever it would be, I'm not going to do it for that length of time. And then you keep practicing, and those times will get longer and longer. You know, that's how you actually change. And particularly like what the Tibetan practice, you know, what real practitioners do actually, is every day. Remember that motivation we did earlier? Like, and Dalai Lama and Lama Zopa, all the teachers really emphasize this, that each morning when you wake up, you set a pure motivation for the day, right? To try to live with compassion, cherishing others, loving others, being kind to others, you know, cultivating wisdom and so on, right? But then at the end of the day, in the evening, the Dalai Lama said that just, you know, recently, he says that he does this still, right? Is that then at the end of the day, you do these 4 steps for the day, right? And you look back over your day and you say, how did I do, you know? And if you're doing that, and it's a dynamic process, this process of restraint, where you say, okay, I made a mistake, you know, tomorrow I'll do this, you know, to change that, right? And then in that way, you'll see yourself improving over time, right? That each week, each month, each year, you'll see real improvement, you know what I mean? But so this power of restraint is really an important one, right? So again, if you're doing like a moral inventory of your whole life, you may look back at things you did as a teenager and say, okay, I could never do that again, that's easy, you know? But then there will be things that you still do every day, right? So if you're doing it every day now, then it's not very realistic to say, I'll never do it again, right? So you have to say, okay, you know, for the next 6 hours, I'm not going to do that.
Can I just say one thing? Talking about the 4 powers, and instead of you call it restraint, what I've seen it called is resolve, and that's really helped me, because to change. I'm just coming back to speech, because to change speech is very, very difficult, because there are patterns that we all have in our lives, and that when we get triggered in certain ways, our patterns come out. And so for me, what I did was I made a resolve, I made a resolution. I like what you said. You can resolve to do it for a day. If you can, my best outcome would be to never do it again. But if I can't do that, then I make a resolve to do it for a day. If I can do it for a day, can I do it for a week? If I can do it for a week, can I do it for a month? And then slowly but surely you start to eradicate it. And the reason why the restraint word doesn't work so well for me is because I sometimes cannot restrain it. It's a pattern, and as best as I might try to restrain it, I'll notice that I've set a resolve now that in all my dealings with all beings, I'm going to use kind, loving speech. I've set that now. I don't always live up to that. So, and sometimes I feel like when the power of that habit energy comes up, I can't restrain it. But all I can do then is I can look back at the action of the day and I can say, okay, did you live, this is how I'm doing it. I said, did you live up to that goal of using kind, compassionate speech in your dealings with all beings? You know you did not. You fell short. And then to redouble the resolve. That's how I'm looking at it. What's your comment on that? Is that similar to what you're saying or different?
Yeah, it's similar. I think to resolve not to do it, to restrain from doing it. It's similar. Yeah, I mean it depends. Whatever word, whichever word. I guess the main thing I think is this the main thing I think is this part about though being being realistic with yourself, and in a way balancing, sort of challenging yourself each day to do better, with not setting unrealistic goals that make you feel worse. You know what I mean? So to me, that's a dynamic psychological process that every person has to figure out for themselves. And I think that's it takes practice in a way to see, so there's one time a person might say, I'm gonna resolve. Let's say I'm gonna resolve not to do that for a week. And they may look and go, wow, I didn't live up to that.
Mm-hmm.
But so we have to kind of challenge ourselves, but also be realistic and not, what's the word? And I guess I'll say too, also there are different ways of doing it. Like I'll share this too. Like I'm going to share 2 stories, or 2 examples, right, of practitioners. One is Geshe Ben Gungel, who was like a Tibetan yogi. And he had been one who, what was it? Before he became a monk, he had become, or a geshe or whatever, he had been a robber. Right? And then he went in retreat, right? And he did this thing where he would have pebbles. Right? At the end of each day, he would think back over his day, and he would put white pebbles for every good thing good thought and good action, and black pebbles for bad. And he would admonish himself. So he would then turn like this and say, Geshe-la, like, do better. If he had too many black ones, he would say, tomorrow, try to be better about this. He would like kind of talk to himself that way, right? And they say that he kind of would do this, like, I'm trying to get the feeling, right? Where for him, it was a sort of like admonishing himself and encouraging himself. Try to do that more, try to do this less. Come on, you can do better tomorrow. And he would actually talk to himself like that. And they say that over time, at the beginning he had these big pile of black, because he had a lot of bad habits because he had been a robber. And then they say over the years, like his piles reversed until many days he would have 0 black pebbles and many white. So that's one way of doing it. You can get the feeling of him, right? Like he had a very earthy flavor too. There were a lot of good stories about him where he would do these very practical. There was one story I'll just share. Like there are many about him, but he was a very practical guy. So there was one where he was in the line to get the soup. The monks they sit in the rows and they serve the soup. And then he realized that the guy was starting at the other end. Like he was at one end. He thought the guy would come to his end to start. It's self-cherishing, right? So he was hoping the guy would start at his end and he would get the best soup. But then he saw the guy start at the other end. And he counted, like, if he goes up and down the rows like this, I'm going to be the last, practically, And so then he started, like, getting upset that he thought all the good noodles and the big pieces of meat are going to other people. I'm not going to, by the time I get, I'll just get broth or something like that. And then he caught himself. And he said, wow, what am I doing? Like, he said, that's all self-cherishing, right? And he was a very practical guy. So he said, okay, self-cherishing wants to eat, so today self-cherishing is not eating. And he turned his bowl upside down and put it away. And when the guy came, he said, okay, it was part of his mental training. It was like, that was part of his mental training, right? He was also the one, right, where that famous story, I told that one before, where he had his altar, right, in his meditation cave. And then one day his sponsor was coming, right? I always like that one. His sponsor was coming to see him. And so he set up his altar extra nice, right, like with extra little offerings, and it looked very pretty. And then he sat down to meditate, and he looked at the altar, and he realized, I just set up that altar out of total self-cherishing. Like, so that my sponsor would think I'm good, and then they'll give me more money. Right? He said I was supposed to be making offerings to the Buddha, but actually I was making offerings to my self-cherishing. And then he thought, that's horrible. He said, like, my whole purpose of being a retreat is to harm self-cherishing. I just made offerings to self-cherishing. So he went outside and picked up a bunch of dirt, and he just threw it over the altar, so that all the water offerings became mud, and like the Buddha was covered in dirt. And he said, okay, now he said that was my offering against my self-cherishing, and then he sat down to meditate. Of course, then his sponsor came and looked and said, wow, your altar looks terrible. And he said, good, like, he didn't explain. He didn't say, oh, I did that as a, and then they said later when his teacher heard what he had done, he said that was the best offering made in all of Tibet. That mud was the best offering made in all of Tibet today, because it was made against self-cherishing, and for compassion,
Just one quick comment about self-cherishing. What I read just recently is that we have to get, and this is a contradiction that I've not been able to resolve, but what I read is that we should not, in this lifetime, we should not be pursuing our own happiness at all. That is one of the ways that you destroy self-cherishing. Is that your view, or do you see it differently than that?
Yeah, the idea would be really like that, let's just say it right, like, pursuing our own happiness at all in this life. Yeah, it would be this, really it's like, I mean, it doesn't, I guess the only thing, like, yeah, I agree with that actually, but you have to be careful. It's not suggesting, I mean, definitely the teachings are not suggesting like harming yourself or something like that, or, like, they're not suggesting, what's the word, like, doing things that harm your body or that kind of thing. But what it's suggesting is focusing all your energy, every moment, on love, right, cherishing others and compassion. So it really is that sense of like letting go of even thinking about your own happiness, because when you think about your own happiness, you create your own suffering. And so it's a mental training to sort of, so it's not a physically to neglect your health or that, but really it is that. It's saying I'm not even going to think about that anymore. I'm only going to, it's because life is too short. I'm going to spend every day, every moment cultivating a sense of love and compassion and cherishing of others. And so mentally that the person is not focusing on their own happiness anymore, because it's sort of like, it's like that's not relevant. Just, so like that.
Thank you.
But okay, so you get the power of restraint, or you can use resolve. It's fine.
Can I ask you a quick
Yeah.
question about that? Does your like your act of restraint or whatever, does it have to be like 100% directly related to whatever act you're purifying? This is something that came up when I used to like do this. So like, can it? I can't think of like a good example that illustrates it right off the top of my head, but if you do something, can you do something else beneficial as like a?
Well, that gets to that's more the power of antidote.
Oh, yeah.
But I mean,
Okay.
you could do like, but you could do like this. Like, let's say a person killed in the past. You know, I guess just to differentiate though, to get like, I'm not sure if this gets to your point, but like if a person killed in the past, right, and they're not going to kill anymore, they could resolve that. But let's say then they're trying to be more refined, and they say, you know what, I'm not even going to hit people, then I'm not going to even shout at people. You know, like, and they're viewing it as related to the killing because they're all motivated by anger. You know, in that case, because they're all related actions, I guess. But in general, if it's doing a positive action, that's more the power of the antidote. So you know, the resolve, the restraint is sort of is sort of a not doing of something.
So you're saying they don't have to be done?
No, it should be taught. Yeah, so it should be. It's like, in other words, like, yeah, you wouldn't say like, in the past I stole, so now I'm not gonna gossip. That wouldn't be a reasonable, resolve or restraint. Whereas if you're trying to purify stealing, it should be something related to stealing in some way. So you wouldn't say I'm trying to purify this karma I did for stealing, so I'm gonna not gossip anymore. That wouldn't be. Whereas you would not gossip to purify karma of gossiping. You wouldn't not gossip to. I'm just giving you an example. Right?
And when
'Cause they're
doing
not-
purification, does it always have to, I mean, do you always have to do like, does it always have to be specific? I find that very difficult a lot of times, like, especially, I mean, I've done a lot of things, like like a lot of it I can't, you know, I can't remember all these things and like go through a list of like 1,000 things I've done and then like go through them and like, can you just generally purify like your negative actions or you know, like in general categories maybe or something, I don't know. And even like in the Buddhist view of like, you know, from past lives doing all these karma, I guess I could try to deduce what, you know, what past life things, you know, that I would want to purify, but obviously there's no really direct way of knowing, at least at my stage of development.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can do general, but I'll say, like, I think it's more, or just, I mean, you can do that, for sure, and there are even prayers like that, general confession prayers or something, you know, where you say, any vows I've broken, any negative actions I've done, all my actions of body, speech, you know, there are prayers like that, but I'll just say, like, I think, my own opinion, I think it's more powerful, though, if you can, I'll give an example of what I mean, like, if you meditate on the faults of self-cherishing, right, and then you realize, wow, all those negative actions are done by self-cherishing, and then you generate real regret, right? Or like, let's say you're studying emptiness, right? And then if you realize, wow, every time I do something while grasping at a truly existent self and truly existent object, I'm creating so much imprints of ignorance and suffering. So everything I've ever done, you can actually generate a feeling, right? If you study Nagarjuna's teachings on emptiness, there can come a point where you generate like a real feeling, like everything I've ever done, motivated by that kind of ignorance, grasping at grasping at true existence, is like horrible. You know, just like that feeling of the poison, right? Now that's general, right? Because actually all negative actions are done with grasping at a truly existent self and object. So I guess what I'm getting at is like, you can do it generally, but I think it's more powerful still if you can get at something like that. Whereas because then there's a stronger feeling of regret, right? And it's more specific, like so that. But that the regret of doing actions motivated or grounded in a grasping at a truly existent self and truly existent object. In one way, that's very general because all actions, actually, according to Kensei Rinpoche pointed out, everything, to some extent, everything we've ever done is that actually. Even our positive actions, actually, as ordinary people, are still grounded in a true grasping at true existence. But if you can generate an understanding, a feeling of how grasping at true existence creates suffering, then it makes it more powerful because the feeling is more, right? You know what I mean? The motivation.
So more like it can be more general in the sense like you said with self-grasping, but just not vague. It has to be like more visceral, but.
I think it's better if it's because
and
like
personal.
Because I've done that. I'm just saying from my own experience, I've done that where I've kind of done maybe a Vajrasattva practice, and I was tired, and I just thought, yeah, everything bad I've ever done, and I'd be pure. But then I realized afterwards, if I did that for a week, then at the end of that week, I was glad I did a little bit of. then I would think of, when I do something like that, then at the end of the week I would think what Lama Zopa talks about, where he says, well, even if you're, like, don't stop doing the Dharma you're pretending to do, you know. So I was like, that's pretend. I was doing pretend Dharma practice, because I was reciting the words, but I wasn't really, like, meditating deeply. You know, so to me, that's still better than, so Lama Zopa would say, he said that, don't stop doing the Dharma practice you're pretending to do, right? So to me, that was, I would look at myself and I go, oh, that week I was pretending to practice, because I did the words, but I didn't do the deeper feel. I didn't really generate regret, actually. I just was sort of vague. My mind, or so it depends on your mind, but for me, I'm just giving an example. I would look back and I think my mind was sort of vague, and I wasn't really regretting. I was sort of thinking, yeah, anything bad I've ever done. It was like, didn't really mean something to me. Whereas, like, if I can meditate on the faults of self-cherishing or the faults of ignorance, you know, or some particular action, then it becomes more, you know, then it becomes more visceral, but also then you can see change over it, right? Then you're less likely to do that action the next day, or you're more likely to be aware of it and catch it. So I think it's up to you, but I mean, you can check your own experience, but for me, that's what I've noticed, is that...
And I'm kind of on that theme, this is the last thing I'll write, but like, should you be doing it like on a daily basis, like you're saying, like really like keeping track of how you're doing and changing, you can see your change and everything, like, you know, at the end of the day, purify, you know, go through what you've done through the day, kind of like we've been talking about. And then normally that's how I hear it explained, but, you know, then like I think, well, you know, nothing I do these days is as bad as things I've done in the past, like at all. And so, you know, then I kind of think like, well, shouldn't I be, you know, I don't know, like what...
Oh yeah, no, it's great to go back to the past, and partly, like, I'll just say my own experience with that too, like, anytime you think about other actions you've done and want to change that karma, that's great.
Okay.
And though, from my experience, and also I think people do this, I think many people do this, is that's also a real benefit to, like, on a day when you have a little more time, you know, then it's really excellent, like on a weekend or just sometime, you know, it's then to really think deeply, like to go back and to think, wow, I never thought about, you know, that this thing I used to do, and I really want to purify that, you know, I never would want to do that again, I don't want to, you know, like, and to go deeper into those kind of things. So yeah, I think it's great. I mean, it's great to do that. You know, and it just depends on your time. If you have time to do that, that's excellent.
Okay.
Yeah, no, so that's really good.
Just a quick. I found that as I started to reflect, it was useful to go back to specific incidents where I committed a past wrong, and what happened was, as I started to do that, I was able to notice, like you were saying, you can't remember everything, but it was amazing how much I actually did start to remember, how many wrongs of that type. That's the way I approached it. I looked at that particular, you know, let's say the wrong of harsh speech, just to use an example, and then I started to see all the times I went back into my life and I saw the specific cases where I'd used harsh speech, and I was filled with very deep regrets. But if I hadn't actually taken the time to go back to those cases, as many as I could remember, then I wouldn't have had as strong a resolve as what I came up with as a result of focusing on those incidents. So I think you're absolutely right. I think it was very helpful to go to specific cases that I could remember, and really reflect on, you know, how I looked at it at that time and how I look at it now, and to see that there is a difference between what was motivating me then and what was motivating me now, and really to use it to deepen my commitment, because I think that with something where your habits are very, very strong, you have to refresh the resolve daily. Otherwise, you will not get through it. And so so that's what I use to refresh my resolve on a daily basis, to never ever speak that way again, for example. Just as an example.
Yeah, no, so I agree. So definitely the more detailed, you know, it makes it more powerful. You're working hard to benefit others, right? So the main thing here is that any positive action can be done to purify negative karma. I'll just make a couple comments though. The one of reciting the names of the 35 Buddhas, that's quite powerful because it actually combines reciting a sutra, right, with also reciting names of Buddhas. But we're going to emphasize today Vajrasattva. And so I'll just give it that, I'm going to just mention that as the example, right? So with Vajrasattva practice, as you'll see when we do it after lunch, Vajrasattva is a particular, like, it's a tantric, what's the word, aspect of a Buddha. So he's white in color, and he holds a Vajra and bell, and in this picture he's embracing a consort, sometimes he's solitary. But I want to say something about, because like, why is reciting a mantra a valid positive action? Because, so again, emphasizing, first of all, it's not the only positive action you can do, but I think it's worth saying something about that. So the idea with Vajrasattva practice is quite interesting. It's actually quite sophisticated if you study it, if you study Vajrasattva practice. So what you're doing in Vajrasattva practice, you'll see, is we visualize Vajrasattva atop our head. And it's not just reciting a mantra, actually. So first you have to do the other 4 powers, right? The other 3 of the 4 powers. But then as you recite Vajrasattva's mantra, if you're doing this practice, what you're doing actually is a combination of things. First of all, combined with Vajrasattva practice, you do meditate on emptiness. That's one thing. Whereas what you think about, whereas when you think what's Vajrasattva, actually Vajrasattva is, when you visualize Vajrasattva, what you're actually, first you meditate on emptiness, and then you think the wisdom understanding emptiness is taking on an appearance of Vajrasattva, right? So actually already you're meditating on emptiness, so it includes that one. And then Vajrasattva is this kind of a Buddha who's white, like kind of like a bright white in color, like the color of paper, white paper. So his aspect, what's we say it, symbolizes and is a reminder also of that clarity of the mind, right? So there is you would be associating to all this, right? So you're thinking emptiness is manifesting in the form of Vajrasattva, and then Vajrasattva's very nature, because actually is inseparable wisdom and bliss, and it's this kind of and that he kind of reflects or is a manifestation or a reminder. His very body is supposed to be a reminder of your own Buddha nature. Let's call it that, right? Your own the emptiness of your own mind, and also the clarity of your own mind. And then also, as you recite the mantra of Vajrasattva, and also if you also you can think of Vajrasattva as also inseparable from the Dalai Lama or your teacher or whatever. And so you can see the complexity here, right? And then as you're reciting his mantra, that's a verbal action. So it's particularly good for purifying verbal negative karma. It's using your verbalization to say something sacred. Right? But as you're reciting Vajrasattva's mantra, if you get good at it, at first you can just imagine nectar coming. Later, if you get good at it, you can actually imagine the mantra in his heart and the nectar descending from him. But nectar and light rays, white light rays and white nectar, descend into your body, right, and completely fill you and wash away. So you're actually thinking of the particular negative tendencies you have, and you're imagining them being washed away by that white light and nectar, until your body is pristine white nectar. So I guess I'm just pointing out there, like, there's a lot that goes on in Vajrasattva practice, right? It's not a simple practice. At the beginning, you don't have to do all of that, right? But over time, let's sort of say it, as you're reciting the mantra, over time, you would be doing all that, right? So then as you're imagining the nectar coming, then again you're meditating more on the aspect of regret, of intelligent regret, right? So so you could be thinking, there are all different things you could be thinking about, right? So maybe you're reciting Om Vajrasattva Samaya Manito, you're reciting his mantra, right? But there's actually, I just want to point out the psychology of it, right? That as you're doing that, sometimes you're focusing on Vajrasattva, thinking, oh, that's emptiness, right? He's a reminder of emptiness. Sometimes you're focusing on Vajrasattva, thinking, oh, he's a reminder of my own Buddha nature. Then sometimes you can be thinking about your own negative actions, generating regret and imagining them being washed away. And then sometimes you can be focusing on your own aspect in being this kind of filled with white, enlightened, pure energy, right? Which is changing your self-image, right? So do you see how it's working on various things? So it's actually, if you view, really, I think, it's reasonable to describe Vajrasattva. It's a spiritual practice, but also a psychological practice to transform your self-image. So it's to purify the negative karma, but so it's not just reciting the mantra. That's my point. If all you did was just recite a mantra, that wouldn't be particularly powerful. Another thing you do with Vajrasattva practice is that you don't just visualize yourself. Once you get good at it, you visualize. There's a traditional visualization where you visualize your parents, your mom and dad, behind you, around you, your relatives, and behind you, your friends, and in front of you, your enemies. The enemies are in front for a reason, it's obvious, right? And then you imagine all of them also being purified, right? So you can imagine nectar descending into all of them purifying them. And there again, you know, you can do that in a general way, but also you can think particularly of the suffering, like of people you've caused suffering to, and imagine them being cleansed, which is a form of meditation on compassion. So ultimately, if you get good at Vajrasattva practice, right, then what you're actually visualizing is yourself surrounded, I mean, you know, and what's the way to say it? You know, that you're doing the practice on behalf of all beings, actually, right? And that you're surrounded by all sentient beings. There's Vajrasattva on everybody's crown, right? Descending nectar, and that everybody's, and that you're meditating essentially at the same time. It's a combined meditation on compassion for all beings, on emptiness, on everybody having Buddha nature, you know, and on purification. So then it becomes a very profound psychological practice, right? So that's really important, you know. So at the beginning, of course, you're not going to be able to do all those things at the same time. But I would say this too, like, because we talked about this in one class where, you know, because some people are doing like 100,000 Vajrasattva repetitions, right? Some of you guys, I think, are working on that. And I want to say something, like, sometimes people have the wrong understanding. They think, oh, I did 100,000 Vajrasattva, so all my karma is purified. And actually, I think the healthy way of viewing that is that that's training yourself so you know how to do Vajrasattva. In other words, like, you do 100,000 just because you want to get good at it, right? So at the end of 100,000 recitations, then you're able to sort of meditate on compassion while doing it and visualize. You know, it's hard to just get used to visualizing something, right? So then you're able to visualize and associate Vajrasattva with emptiness and with the purity of your mind. You're able to visualize all sentient beings and start generating compassion. You're able to, while reciting the mantra, first you have to get used to the mantra, but then you start to associate the mantra itself with the resonance of emptiness. In other words, like, that the mantra is just not a mantra, it's actually, you're actually contemplating that yeah, you could say that. I mean, that's a fair way to describe it. So it's a reflection of emptiness, or it's a reminder of emptiness, something like that. So it's just to train your mind so that you can do Vajrasattva practice well. And then that's one, and part of it is like, you know, so then if you're if you're doing a lot of, and then in daily life, like a Tibetan, let's say, practitioners, oftentimes every night, then they would do Vajrasattva. They would recite like 21 mantras of Vajrasattva every night as part of their, like, thinking about the day. You know, and then they would also do other things throughout their life to purify, like, you know, then they might do other things to purify particularly negative karmas, but that would be like kind of a regular practice that's always ongoing. You know, so that the typical pattern would be something like that a person might do, you know, a lot of Vajrasattva retreats, but also most, like, I think, most practitioners of real, like, of all four, actually, this is common to all the Tibetan traditions, and most of them do that, like every night, people, 21, in conjunction with the four powers, so, you know, and then do other positive actions to purify other particular things.
Isn't it like doing like purification more important than meditation?
What they say is like, yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Is doing purification more important than meditation? So what I would say a couple things. One is that, you know, in a sense, actually, well, first of all, this, I mean, that if you're doing the purification well, then it is meditation, actually, right? Because you're contemplating karma, actually, right? Or as you're contemplating, or as then you're training your mind, right? You're training your mind to, like, not do negative, you know, like, there is, if you do it well, right? Actually, if you think about it, like, let's say you do a Vajrasattva practice, right? So one thing is, in a sense, I mean, certainly it is a meditation this way, right? If you do it well, you've meditated on refuge, on bodhicitta, right? Because those are the, by meditating on regret, you've meditated extensively on karma. And then when you're doing the actual Vajrasattva, let's say, right, you're thinking about bodhicitta and emptiness, right? So then it becomes a meditation. But then, but I think this is also getting a deeper, what you're really asking is like, Lama Tsongkhapa, when he, like, I think it was he was taught, you know, like Lama Tsongkhapa used to have those visions of Manjushri, right? All the time he would have visions of Manjushri. And they say that he asked Manjushri, like, what's the best way to gain realizations of, like, Lam Rim and other subjects, right? And so then, like, what Manjushri said was, like, you had to do, Manjushri mentioned, I think, 4 things, right? So you had to purify your negative karma, right? Because that's the obstacles. You have to accumulate a lot of positive karma by doing positive things like meditating on bodhicitta and doing positive actions, right? Then he said, make requests or supplications or something like that to your teacher. You know, he said, and then your meditation on the stages of the path will bring the result of realization. So he said you have to combine like that was his advice to Lama Tsongkhapa, was if you combined all four of those four factors, that then it would be, and sometimes they even say, I think that was just that was Manjushri's advice, but I think sometimes then, I thought this was quite nice. I can't remember who said it, one Lama said, if you purify your negative karma, right, and you accumulate positive tendencies, and then you meditate on the stages of the path to enlightenment, and you make supplications, like they said. Then they said that, even if it seems impossible, even realizations that would seem impossible at first will naturally happen, like just organically will arise, because you're removing all the obstacles, you're creating the cause. It's all karma actually, right? In other words, if you're removing it's all causality, right? If you're removing the obstacles of something happening, and you're creating the cause for something to happen, and then you're doing the thing to make it manifest, then it will manifest even if, what's there to say, just naturally, it'll happen, you know what I mean? Whereas if you don't purify the karma, then I think this is what you're getting at. If you don't purify certain karmic obstacles or something like that, then no matter how much, you can meditate a lot, and if there's something getting in the way, actually, you can think of that like in a very subtle karmic way, but you can also just think of it sort of obviously, right? Like Nagarjuna said that sometimes. He said, he would say, for example, like somebody wanted to meditate on emptiness, right? And then they were still having overwhelmed with desire, right? Like, so they would, like he was giving examples where they're looking at food and they desperately want to eat more and they think it's great, and they're looking at people of the opposite gender or whoever and thinking of all of it, and thinking all these things. And then he says, and then they're going to meditate on emptiness, and they think they're going to realize that it's impossible, because they have so many other levels of projection going on. That he said, like, they have to overcome those other things first, right? And then it becomes, then they're like, then if they meditate on emptiness, it's much more realistic that they could realize it. So, in a similar way like that, we have to get rid of our inner obstacles. So if we train our mind every day and getting better and better, right, then like the higher stages become easier, or if other realizations become easier. And otherwise, like, you can meditate for a long time and not ever get there. Because think about it, if you're not purifying your negative karma, let's say you're still doing negative actions, right? You're getting angry and telling people off. So like, let's say that day you get angry and you tell somebody off, and then you're like, talking about nonsense for hours and hours, and then you're like, whatever, what's the word, all focused on like getting ahead of other people and competing with people. Then you come and sit down and meditate, okay, bodhicitta. That's totally silly, right? Because, you get it. There's no meaning, then it like becomes, and somewhere deep in your mind, it's silly, right? In other words, you're being hypocritical, and so you're not going to be able to realize bodhicitta. Whereas if you do the purification every day and you see your behavior improving, then when you sit down to meditate on bodhicitta, you can feel, okay, I'm getting closer to that. So I think that's it. Yes, those four.
Can you list those real briefly again, the four, just?
I think it's like purification, accumulating merit, or accumulating positive energy or positive virtue, making they sometimes say making heartfelt supplications to your teacher. We could call it like Guru Yoga, something like that. And then actually meditating on the stages. Meditating on the stages of the path, or Lam Rim, or whatever you're meditating. You can be meditating. Actually, those apply whether you're meditating on like Lam Rim or you're meditating on any dharma practice, really. Those would still apply to any dharma practice. So those would apply to Lam Rim, but they would apply to Tantra, they would apply to, I guess everything's included in Lam Rim, so there is nothing.
So one more time, those are the four elements.
Those are four elements, just like that, like Lama Tsongkhapa, the great, that's Lama Tsongkhapa, the painting of Lama Tsongkhapa. So those are just like when he once, my recollection at least, I think I'm remembering it right, that he once asked Manjushri, the Buddha of wisdom, how to go about gaining realizations of the path to enlightenment. And that Manjushri said, if you do those four things, and it was quite logical. He was just saying, if you do those four things, then organically the realizations will happen because you're creating the right circumstances. But that if you leave one of those out, then it's harder to gain the realizations. It's not. I don't think it's impossible, but that's make it easier.
The four things are?
So the four things mentioned, one was purification, right, which we're doing. Another is accumulating positive karma, right? So that would be doing positive actions, and those could just be meditating on love and compassion, right? Or it could be going out and helping others, or it could be making an offering, whatever you're doing to make positive karma. And then the third one was like either, there are different ways to translate, but sometimes they say supplications or prayer requests or something like that to your teacher. And then the fourth one was actually meditating on the topic. So if you wanted to realize emptiness, then meditating on emptiness. You want to realize bodhicitta, meditating on bodhicitta. If you want to realize compassion, meditating on great compassion. So whichever topic you want to meditate on, then actually doing the meditation itself.
What does the supplications to the teacher mean?
Supplication to the teacher means like what that really means is this, is like I mean, that's a big subject actually. So, but I'll say a little bit.
If
Just
you
brief.
don't want to answer that now. it's
No, I'll say a brief. I'll give a brief answer, but it's a bigger subject. But really, it's this. It's that if you have, and I think in that context, what it means is that it's like Milarepa with Marpa, or it's like in other words, that if you have a teacher, first of all, I mean, it depends if you have a teacher, right? But if you have a teacher, like really, it's this actually. It's that what they say is this: is if you have a teacher who's personally, like a guru, they're talking about. What do they mean? They mean a guru in that context, or a lama. With the real meaning of that term, which is like, it's not just a teacher in the sense of like an academic teacher, but a teacher who, to you, represents or plays the role of the Buddha. There was that in that sense. That they're not the historical Buddha, because the historical Buddha, whatever, was 2,500, 2,600 years ago. But if you have a guru or a lama or a teacher like that who sort of is playing the role and representing the Buddha to you, that in some sense relationally for you, they come to embody the qualities of enlightenment, and also embody, sort of pass along the lineage of the teachings. And so it's so actually it could be in person making supplications, like asking them to bless you. But it's more in this context, they're more talking about thinking of your teacher, thinking of the teachings they gave you, and praying to realize those teachings. And so it's more internal. I mean, it could literally be going to your teacher and saying, "Please bless me to realize that." But actually, if you did that all the time, it would just probably
Be annoying.
yeah, it'd be annoying to. But it's more internally that when you're meditating, and actually, like when Khenchen Rinpoche taught, actually the book, those little postcards are out there for the book Easy Path, and he taught on that here, and that book really very well sort of teaches this practice, where it talks about, like in that book, the Panchen Lama, who wrote the original text, and then Khenchen Rinpoche comments on it, describes how before meditating on a given topic of the stages of the path, that you would visualize your teacher on your crown, in the form of the Buddha, and you would just say, you would like pray, like, "Please bless me to realize it as you realized it. Just as you realize this point, may I be able to realize it." Then you imagine nectar descending, sort of granting you the blessings to realize that. And so there's a kind of and then you meditate. So it's a practice like that. But well, actually, so yeah, are there other questions about this stuff?
I have kind of one about. It's negative karma. It's easy for me to sit on the mat and kind of maybe generate compassion for people, but you get out in the real world and actually have to deal with situations of people. Not so easy. One person in particular that I can guarantee you every time I'm going to create negative karma with, and yet when I think of that person and contemplate, I feel like I can feel compassion for this person. I feel like I can say, well, looking for happiness, and almost feel like, it's kind of pathetic, some of the things that are going on, and I can feel some compassion. And I can guarantee you, every time I have an interaction, I'm going to get upset. So, at what point do I say, do I meet that head on and go for it, or do I continue to try and avoid interaction so that I'm not?
Great question.
Yeah, so I think like this is where, to me, this is where the nightly practice of purification is really helpful, actually, because I think, and I was saying earlier about the realistic, like it has to be realistic to oneself.
Right.
So I think like only you can answer that question for yourself, but I think to me that's that practice that the oral tradition and the real practitioners that I think is really interesting and dynamic, is that someone has to really contemplate and one has to ask oneself, right, like, okay, so the most important thing, right, is not to do negative. In other words, if I go interact with, so if I'm imagining that situation, right, so I would think you would actually contemplate, if I go and interact with that person and I get angry, then the disadvantages are huge, right? Like in other words, I'm miserable at that time. I'm making them miserable. Anybody who sees us you know, it has to be around us at that time, it's not gonna enjoy it, that process. And then also if you think about like the future, right, then it also compounds the relation, you know, you would actually think deeply about all these things, right? Then in the future, it's gonna keep happening with that person, then also in future lives, it's gonna continue, you know, so in this life I'll make problems, in future lives I'll make problems, then also like, you know, all those teachings from Shanti Deva, right? I work so hard to create positive, karma, but then I go do that, and then, it, you know, our anger is, you know, anger harms the positive karma, so it won't ripen and all that. You know, so you think like, so you would think deeply over and over again until you generate the real feeling of the intelligent regret. You know, and then if you do the other practices, but then when you get to the part about the restraint, or what was the word you used?
A resolve?
Resolve, or, you know, then you would, so then you'd have to really, this is the hard part, I think, for that, right? Because the regret wouldn't be that hard, I don't think. But then the hard part is this, is to say, okay, so then if there are all those disadvantages, what can I do? You know, and then you have to really ask yourself, like, for just the next time I'm going to see them, just one time, right? Like, could I? Is there a way I could be with them and be patient and not get angry? Right? And if there is, then one will say, okay, I'm going to take on that challenge. If one really feels confident, I could be around that person. But if one says, you know what, every time, like you said, every time I'm around them, I get mad. I have too many. It's too much of a habit. They're too good at pushing my buttons, whatever the things are. Like, then there's a real cost there, but you would, like, this is part of the purification process, is to say, you know what, that I'm going to avoid them. Like, even if there's a cost to avoid, even if it's embarrassing, or it's uncomfortable, or, like, that for this length of time, let's say, you know, that for the, you know, the next time I would ordinarily go to a certain thing, or be around them for this reason, I'm going to not go, and that's part of my process of purifying my karma, until I feel strong enough. You know, like in what we'll say, until I feel strong enough that when I'm around them, I'll be able to be patient. I'm going to avoid them, to protect them even, and to protect myself. You know, because it's protecting both, right? It's not good for them, and it's not good for me. And so to protect them, out of compassion for them, also to protect myself, and also out of compassion for other people, and out of compassion for myself in future lives, out of compassion for the people who have to be around that. You know, all that, right? So you would say, okay, so I'm going to avoid them then, and even if it's uncomfortable to avoid them, I'm going to do it because that's my commitment to my practice. And then you really would, you know, so if you don't believe you can be around the person, then it is better to avoid them, actually. For sure, I think that's true, you know, so, and then one has to kind of keep checking, and at a certain point, maybe, you know, maybe one says, well, in this life, I'll never be that, you know, like that person's so difficult, I'm never gonna be up to it. You know, or maybe there comes a point where you say, like, you know, those, like, you know, like Lama Zopa always does this thing where he says, like, I'll tell a story, like, I had a friend who had, like built like had spent their literally the last money they had in the whole world to build a retreat cabin. And it was like way off in the woods on property of a Buddhist center. But somebody didn't like them, so they reported them to somebody or some county something. And then they had to, it was like a beautiful, gorgeous retreat cabin. They were totally dead broke, but they were going to go on a retreat for like a decade or something. And then because the person reported them, they had to knock down, like they could take out the windows, but then they had to not only knock down the entire structure, but they had to cover it over with dirt so nobody could ever tell that there was something there.
Oh my lord.
And so then, like, all they had were some windows, basically. Just all they had to carry my windows out. And you know, and so they were totally freaked out, of course. Right now I'm dead broke, I have no place to live, I'm homeless, and my retreat cabin, you know, I have these windows with no place to live. And the retreat cabin is just a bunch of dirt, a mound of dirt now, you know. And so I think somehow Lama Zopa heard about it. He said, oh, you know, he said something like, it'd be very good to cherish, the person who turn you in, it's really good to cherish them, you know, like, and, if you could give them a gift, you know, like cherishing them more than yourself, you know, and try to make them happy, and what would they really like that you could give them as a present, you know, and I think,
Windows.
that's all I have. And I think my friend said that they weren't able to do it quite yet. Like, maybe later, I don't know, you know. Like, you know, so it depends on one's own level. You know, like, I thought it was good that my friend said, like, maybe later or something. But someone has to check one's own level and see, you know, like, because there comes a point, right, like Shanti Deva says, right, in his Guides to the Bodhisattva's Way, he says there comes a point where a person could think, oh, the enemy's the most precious one, and, you know, you feel like this incredible gratitude to the enemy. But if we're not there, to pretend doesn't help, right? In other words, if you're really feeling angry and you're just, you know, then that doesn't help. So I think it requires like a lot of, like to really do this practice requires a fair amount of like self-honesty about one's own limitations at a given time, knowing that they can change, right, as you progress in your practice. But so I don't know, does that answer the question? Yeah, but sometimes it's hard to avoid it, right, like that's hard too, but like,
Yeah, well, it's almost impossible, but, and it's not every, you know, I mean, there are times when it's not overt, no, I don't really say or do anything, but inside,
yeah,
it's just like,
I think that's a point in Shantideva's book which I like because I find that useful for myself, and he says, be like a piece of wood. So
Yes.
like, you know, if you cannot do something good, just like, you know,
do nothing.
which helps me a lot because sometimes I'm in a situation where, like you know, I can feel compassion for the person far away, right? Then if I have to, then I know I'm not going to be able to do it. So it's just like, you know, act like a piece of wood, you know, do nothing and just, you know, chill out. And I think that's helpful to me.
Yeah, yeah, at least then you're not harming them, you're just feeling
Right.
that.
So if you by mistake you say something, can you just, and then you feel like, can you regret it immediately?
Yeah,
By mistake you say something bad and then immediately you realize that you did something wrong.
yeah, the sooner the better, right?
So do you accumulate the karma for that?
It's less powerful. I mean, the sooner you regret it, the less powerful it is.
Okay.
So if you can, yeah, that's the teaching is that the faster you're able to, and you can see that actually on a practical level, that's true, right? In other words, that's one of the goals if you think about it. Like Dalai Lama said that. He said, you know, like sometimes Dalai Lama, when people say about progress, right? You know, because people say, oh, you're like, you know, and he always is very like down to earth, right? But sometimes he talks about that where I really like that where the Dalai Lama talks about how, you know, so if like before, and actually this would be maybe relevant to your example, right? Like the Dalai Lama says, well, before if you got like angry, he doesn't use this language, but I'll use my own language for it. But you know, before you like your anger level was an 8 out of 10 and it lasted for like 3 hours, and then if after a while you can get to a 7 out of 10 that lasts for 2.5 hours, you know, that's progress actually. You know, and like, and so the Dalai Lama talks about it that way. Like, you know, he says, you know, if you can get a little like 5 seconds less, 10 seconds less, 10, you know, and then if you notice it quicker and you stop it sooner, you know, because he was saying, you know, then over the course of a year or two, you know, then you reach a point where you say, wow, like it used to be 3 hours, now it's only 45 minutes. That's big progress. You know, like, so I think that's good. Yeah, that's like part of the way you train. Mind first, like so we're gonna do some Vajrasattva practice, right? And then I guess I have 2 questions. One is, so in this little booklet that we handed out, this from FBMT's translations or whatever. There's a long version of the Vajrasattva practice that runs from like page 7 up to page like 21. And then there's an abbreviated version that runs from page just 23 to 27 or something like that. So it's much shorter. They're the same basic practice, but the longer one includes a lot more details, you know, visualizations and offerings and different things. Do people prefer, I mean, to me it doesn't really matter, so I want to ask like a vote or so. Do people prefer the long version or the short version?
Long one.
Long, okay.
Alright.
Really? Wow.
Abe is hardcore.
Are you feeling dirty?
Yeah.
And then the second question is people's preference, like on you know, so we can just what's it say?
This is my preference. Nobody else.
Does anybody else have a
Cool with
strong
me.
preference? Other way,
I'll go along with that, that sounds good.
Nobody wants to say.
Yeah.
Well, that would give us more time to talk after maybe, but
or you put people in an awkward position.
Yeah.
But then the second question is like, do people prefer? Like, I think definitely we should pause and meditate on the regret, for example, and pause and meditate on different points. I guess the question is like, just for me to get feedback from you all, is how much should I talk and how much should we want silent in those times? Like, definitely we should pause to have time to meditate, but it's up to you guys. If you want more guidance in how to contemplate, or if you want more silence, it doesn't matter to me.
Either way.
Either way.
I like
Need-
guidance.
need
I like guidance also.
It helps me when
Okay.
we're away from here to know how to do what to do.
So we'll do more guidance today. That way, yeah, that way when you guys are home, you. But well, here's my suggestion. Let's go. Unless people have a pressing question, we can go ahead and do this and then do the questions after. Or but if there's a pressing question that relates to the practice itself, or that you feel like you need before we do it, otherwise we'll have time for more questions after. But
Okay.
is there something you feel like you need to know before we do it?
Which pronunciation do we use? Like the old school one or the Tibetan?
You mean for the mantra itself?
Yeah.
Uh,
I
I'll,
saw like a.
we'll read it together a little bit, but You can do, yeah, so what he's getting at is this, is that, so for the actual mantra, right, on the page 16, right, it says, you can see this mantra station where it says Om Vajra Haruka Samaya Manu Palaya Haruka. And then underneath the common mention Om Benza Haruka Samaya Manu Palaya Haruka Deno Haruka. So basically what that is there are different ways of pronouncing the Sanskrit. And you can do either one, actually. Like definitely you can do either one because yeah, whichever one you want.
Okay. I didn't know if we were doing it out loud or something.
What about
Yeah, I think we'll do it out loud 3 times
what about
together.
the negro one, like over Savasamaya, instead of doing the Hiroka?
Yeah, you can substitute. I'll say that too, just for people who already know about that. Like, so you can, if you prefer, like this one, FBMT because of Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa has always had a connection to Haruka Vajrasattva in particular. But there are many different forms of Vajrasattva, so there's, so if you know a different form you prefer that one, then just do that, it's fine.
So just one question before you get started. Did you complete the discussion about the antidote? I just remember you saying that you were going to come back and spend a bit of time with that. Did you come back and spend a little time? Did I miss it?
Yeah, I don't, I'm trying to think if there was more to say. Like, yeah, no, I mean, I could talk more about it. Do you have a particular question about it?
Well, just that my understanding is that with the antidote, what you have to do there is you have to commit yourself to doing the opposite to what you've been doing. Is that the correct way to understand it?
In a way, it's correct, but what they'll say, I mean, in a sense, that's correct. But like the opposite in the sense that if you were doing, I mean, you were doing something negative before, and you're going to do something positive now, so that's correct. But it doesn't have to be an exact opposite. In other words, like with the power of what I was calling restraint, right? With that, it's clearly it has to be related to that. In other words, if you were lying, you know, that's you know trying not to lie, and making an effort to not lie. But with the power of the antidote, it has to be something positive. So in that sense, opposite. But it doesn't have to be directly related. So you know, in one way, of course, if like in your example, if it was a negative action of speech, you know, mantras are great because they're speech, right? Or going and saying something kind to others also is an example of speech. But there's not, there's the tradition is that you could do, so for example, even with a negative action of body, let's say you, you know, stole something. You know, if you wanted to practice generosity as an antidote to that, that's great. But you could also do Vajrasattva as an antidote to that, and that's acceptable. So it doesn't have to be a direct, like
So
behavioral
can
problem.
I just give you one example quickly, and then
Yeah.
I'll start. Like what I did, even just this week, was I went to certain people in my life and I apologized to them for using harsh speech in the past.
That's
They didn't really know why I was bringing it up now because it's like it was things that even went back years, and they don't hold it against me. But it was just my way of trying to. Is that an antidote or no?
Let's see. Yeah, I think so. Apologizing can be an antidote, sure. Because it's a positive action in relation to that person. Yeah, so, yeah.
But it doesn't have to be related, is what you're saying. Could be
Doesn't have to be.
any virtue, any
Any
virtue.
virtue can be, yeah. Yeah, and it doesn't like so. Yeah, so you can do yeah. So it doesn't have to be directly.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank
Is
you.
Haruka a different yidam or deity or whatever than Vajrasattva, or is it another form of Vajrasattva? I don't exactly understand.
Haruka is actually like the name of a. This is, I mean, this particular one. It basically, like you know, there are different. In Tantric Buddhism, there are different tantras. So, like the Guhya Samaja Center is named after the Guhya Samaja Tantra,
Right.
actually. Right. There's Guhya Samaja there. So, so like the Guhya Samaja Center is named after the Guhya Samaja Tantra, which is a father tantra. So then Chakra Samvara, Haruka Chakra Samvara is a particular tantra. Like there's an actual translation of it in English now called the Chakra Samvara Tantra. And so so this version of Vajrasattva is associated with that particular tantra. So it's associated with a particular deity.
Okay.
So yeah. So I think that if you do the Haruka Vajrasattva, it gives you some maybe connection to Chakra Samvara, Haruka Chakra Samvara practice. I have a feeling that maybe, I'm not really sure, but I'm guessing that maybe like Lama Yeshe and so I thought there was some meaning to that people, that it would somehow benefit people to have that connection.
Is the image meant to be a particular size? The Vajrasattva visualization image, is it life size or a particular? Is it meant to be a particular?
I'm trying to see in this one, visualization.
What about that one? Which way it's facing to?
think it's facing
Yeah, so
out.
Is it facing out?
Vajrasattva always is on you. So basically, when we get to that part, it doesn't say here, because there are different, I've heard different things on that, so I'm not sure. But basically, so Vajrasattva is facing, when you visualize Vajrasattva in this practice, and all Vajrasattva practices, usually, he's on your crown facing the same direction as you, and kind of here. So ordinarily, you don't visualize him life size, you visualize him smaller than life size. I guess in theory you could visualize them bigger, but usually, and sometimes it's good to visualize quite small, but I think usually, we'd have to look it up, I don't wanna say something wrong, but it's not life size, it's usually smaller, like, kind of like up there. Yeah, I don't think, some practices you visualize very small, but Vajrasattva I've never heard it very small either, so I think, but definitely smaller than life size. Yeah, some people say that, or some people say a hand. So I've heard different things like that. So the Vajrasattva practice, I'm not sure what the correct, because yeah, I've heard the thumb, I've heard it small, like size of a hand, and I've heard things like so. I think it depends on your ability to visualize. Sometimes the problem is sometimes if you try to visualize small like a thumb, some people can't focus that. It requires more the subtler the object, the more concentration that's required. So sometimes a little bigger, it's easier. Because as you get more advanced in concentration, you try to make sometimes objects smaller because it refines it's a tool for concentration. But I think at the beginning it's not good to go too small, you won't be able to, your mind will be too tight. So I think at the beginning it's okay maybe the size of like a hand or something. Okay, so let's yeah, so we'll pause numerous times to meditate. But so let's start with the initial visualization on page 7. So actually, first, we'll go through it slowly, right? So on the right side, you think of your father. And on the left side is your mother, right? And so actually visualize them there, right? Actually think of your mom and dad. And of course, the point here is to generate compassion for them, right? Whether they're alive or whether they've passed away. Is you generate is that you think of that they're subject to suffering, just as you are subject to suffering, just as everybody's subject to suffering. And this is starting the meditation on compassion. Right, so then in front of you, you visualize your enemy and those sentient beings who make you agitated. And so that can include like personal people who you find annoying. But you can also include you have people in your personal life, but also like if there are people in the news, whether it's, if you find yourself having prejudice against people, from a certain country, people of a certain, ethnicity or religion or whatever, then you can include them there, right? If there are people you think have harmed you, you include them there. And then people who you're attached to, like friends, relatives, and so on, behind you. And then all sentient beings in the form of human beings all around. So even if they're actually in the animal realm or some other realm like hell or hungry ghost, you imagine them as humans for now, for this visualization. And so you're just visualizing yourself like surrounded, like on a giant plane, right, surrounded by limitless numbers of sentient beings. And even though we'll meditate more on bodhicitta later, of course the point here, right, is that you're thinking that you're doing this practice, cherishing all those sentient beings with a sense of love and compassion, wishing to liberate all of them from suffering and its causes, and to lead all of them to happiness and the causes of happiness. But that's the whole reason. That's why we start with this visualization. So you think like these are all my even when the enemies are actually like relatives to me, or like parts of my own body, or so cherished, like there's no difference between them and me. They desperately want to be happy. They desperately don't want to suffer. There's not the slightest difference between their wish and my wish. To be happy and not to suffer. And so to only like cherish myself is silly and childish and illogical also. And harmful to myself and harmful to those others. So kind of thinking about deep in their heart, each one of those beings, your mom, dad, relatives, strangers, enemies, they all desperately want to be happy, don't want to suffer. You generate some feeling of cherishing them, a feeling that they're precious, that their happiness is important. And so continuing to kind of imagine them all there, you feel, right, my purpose for doing this practice is for all universal sentient beings, to be a benefit to all of them. So continuing to visualize all sentient beings, or imagine or think of all sentient beings around you as a reminder of compassion, bodhicitta. Then in the space in front of you, kind of floating in space above your enemies, you could visualize like a blue Buddha, Vajradhara. So he's blue in color, he sits on a lotus. And he's blue and he's embracing a red consort. And this is a practice of Guru Yoga, so you think actually that this blue Vajradhara and his consort Dorje Palmo, that they are just an emanation of like the Dalai Lama, or an emanation of whoever your teacher is. And so now you imagine that yourself, along with all the other sentient beings, take refuge. So you can imagine you're leading them in recitation. So actually, maybe we can recite this together on page 8. We'll recite 3 times, just the bold, like the in the bold phase. I forever take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. I take refuge in all the 3 vehicles, in the Dhakas and Bahinis of secret mantra yoga, in the heroes and heroines, gods and goddesses, and in the bodhisattvas of the 10 bhumis. But most of all, I take refuge in my holy Guru forever. I forever take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. I take refuge in all 3 vehicles, in the Dhakas, the keys of secret mantra yoga, in the heroes, heroines, and gods and goddesses, and in the bodhisattvas of the 10 bhumis. But most of all, I take refuge in my holy Guru forever. I forever take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. I take refuge in all the 3 vehicles, in the Dhakas, the keys of secret mantra yoga, in the heroes, heroines, the gods and goddesses, and in the bodhisattvas of the 10 bhumis. But most of all, I take refuge in my holy Guru forever. I must become Heruka in order to lead all sentient beings to the sublime state of Herukahood. I must become Heruka in order to lead all sentient beings to the sublime state of Herukahood. I must become Heruka in order to lead all sentient beings to the sublime state of Herukahood. So there, we just pause. So Herukahood means, Buddhahood. It's just another synonym. So here we really, again, meditate on cherishing others and on bodhicitta. That's the meaning of that verse. So if you feel a sense of cherishing others, right, and that the others suffering endlessly and pointlessly is unbearable, but then you think, right, in my present unenlightened state, actually it's difficult even not to harm others, much less to help them. And certainly I'm not capable of leading all beings to enlightenment. You can't give somebody else what you don't have. I'm not even enlightened myself. So So of course I can't lead others to enlightenment yet. So I must achieve enlightenment. Because the more enlightened I am, then the more help I can be to others. And if I can achieve the state of Buddhahood, of full enlightenment, then I'll be most useful to others. So my purpose for doing this Vajrasattva practice is wanting to take care of others with love, cherishing, like adoring others, feeling they're precious. And I take that responsibility on myself to progress to enlightenment so that I can actually benefit those others. So then, once you've generated that motivation, then you can imagine that Buddha, Vajradhara in front of you, smiles, is happy that you generated that, floats to the crown of your head and dissolves into blue light that dissolves into your body. That's in the nature of kind of blissful wisdom. It kind of energizes your body with that blissful wisdom. So you can imagine the kind of blue, enlightened energy of bliss kind of filling, radiating through your body, purifying any diseases, any obstacles, any ignorance. Then very briefly, we'll meditate on the emptiness now. And so the simplest way, just a very simple version, is that, so you notice the feeling of a real me sitting here. Like I really exist, I'm really sitting here. I exist in some kind of a independent, real, solid way. So you notice that feeling. And yet that solid, real, kind of permanent, independent self, if you search your body, it's not there in any of your organs. If you look at the mind is changing moment to moment, with awareness of different thoughts and feelings. You won't find that in your mind. It doesn't exist somewhere other than your body and mind. So although that truly existent I appears, that solid I appears to your awareness, appears to you, your mind and body are empty of that I. It's unfindable. Like a hallucination. Now within the context of that emptiness, that not finding of a truly existent self, about 6 inches above the crown of your head, imagine a syllable palm which transforms into a 1,000-petaled lotus. So it's kind of a beautiful lotus there on the crown of your head. And on that, a syllable ah transforms into a cushion, a white cushion like the moon. That looks like the moon. And the lotus and the moon cushion aren't solid, they're like holograms. They're like made of light. and translucent. So they're not solid. And that lack of solidity is a reminder of that awareness of the lack of inherent solid existence. In the center of the moon cushion, a syllable hum transforms into a five-pronged vajra, which will hum in its center, and the hum radiates light in all directions. And the light is in the nature of blissful psychic energy of all the Buddhas, the Gurus, the Bodhisattvas. So that blissful energies radiating from the hum on your crown purifies you and all sentient beings. And the whole universe melts into light. It's in the nature of blissful wisdom. And then that infinite kind of array of light, an entire universe filled with light, withdraws back to your crown. And the hum and the vajra transform into Vajrasattva, Buddha Vajrasattva. So Vajrasattva is white in color, with one face and two arms. He sits in like the full lotus posture of meditation. In his right hand, at the level of his heart, he holds a ritual implement of a vajra, and he holds a bell in his left hand that he rests in his lap. His consort, Dorje Nema Karmo, is also white in color and embraces him. She has one face and two arms and holds a curved knife and a skull cup. They're like celestial deities. Right? So they're translucent, like holograms, radiant, brilliant white in color, and they're wearing celestial silks, like not normal clothes, but kind of celestial silks. Each of them at their crown has an om, at their throat an ah syllable, and at their hearts a hum. So again, like before, the hum radiates light in all directions. And from those light rays, all the Buddhas appear in the space in front of you. So now we're going to make offerings to all those Buddhas. So there are some verses, there's some Sanskrit that we recite. It's on page 10. So you're imagining now Vajrasattva's on your crown. You're surrounded by all sentient beings. And all these like Buddhas, enlightened beings and deities are in front of you. And so now you can see the description here. So there are just these mantras we recite as we offer. So Om Kandaroi Om Om Te. Om Svabhava Shuddho Sarva Dharma Svabhava Shuddho Ham. That mantra is again reminding us of emptiness. So all is void. Out of the void appears the syllable ah. It transforms into a huge white skull cup containing 5 meats and 5 nectars. They become the ocean of Amrita. So basically we're creating divine offerings. So actually in this one, we're actually offering, it says here on page 11, it's actually what you're offering here is, it's the offerings ordinarily made to a king when they come. In India, in ancient India, they would make these offerings to the kings. You're offering water for drinking, water for washing, flowers, incense. So it's just a traditional set of offerings. So we can actually do, we'll just, if you want, we can go ahead and do the, do that. So, Om, 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 Vajrasattva, Om, Vajrasattva, Om Vajrasattva Pushme when we say this mantra, Ja, Hum, Bam, Ho, what that means is just that all those Buddhas in front dissolve into the Vajrasattva on the crown. So Ja, Hum, Bam, Ho. So that's what it says, they become non-dual. So those wisdom, basically all of them dissolve into Vajrasattva. So now, again, brilliant lights radiate from the home of the divine heart, invoking the initiating deities of the 5 families. So he's just inviting more Buddhas, the 5 Buddha families. So we'll just quickly do those offerings. Om Pancha Kula Sapariwan Argam Panya Puse Tupe Aloke Gande Yuga Shakta Vasisha. O the Tathagata, please bestow upon me the Ruga Vajrasattva initiation. Upon this request, all the Tathagatas hold up their initiation vases, which are full of Amrita energy of divine transcendental wisdom, and Amrita starts to flow. Om Sarva Tathagata Adisekata Samaya Shri. So the divine body of perfect absolute wisdom, Ruga Vajrasattva, is completely filled with Amrita energy of blissful transcendental wisdom. Some Amrita overflows and transforms into Akshobhya, who adorns Vajrasattva's crown. The initiation deities melt into light and sink into Vajrasattva. At the center of the moon disk at the divine heart stands the seed-syllable hum, encircled by the 100-syllable mantra, standing counterclockwise around the edge of the moon disk. And then one more time, now we're making offerings to actually to Vajrasattva. Om Vajrasattva Agam Bhagyam Pushpe Tupe Aloke Gande Yudya Shakta Om Vajrasattva Om non-dual divine wisdom, magnificent inner jewel ornament of all mother sentient beings, supreme, unchanging, everlasting great bliss, indestructible, magnificent wisdom mind that releases all sentient beings from all negativities of body, speech, and mind, especially broken vows and pledges. To you, glorious Vajrasattva, I prostrate. I think we'll jump to the short mandala. So there here you're just imagining offering, so still Vajrasattva, right, is on your crown. So here you're imagining offering the universe, especially and offering everything to Vajrasattva. So this ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, the 4 continents, the sun and moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. The right view of Shunyata is one with the wisdom of great bliss. The wisdom transforms into Mount Meru, the sun, the moon, and all other phenomena in the universe. I offer everything magnificent to you, ocean of great kindness, who are liberated and who liberates all other sentient beings as well. The objects of my attachment, aversion, and ignorance, friends, enemies, and strangers, my body, wealth, and enjoyments. Without any sense of loss or hesitation, I offer this collection. Please accept it with pleasure and bless me and all sentient beings free from future presence. Yadam Guru So there you can actually imagine, right, because it says, right, part of the purpose there of offering everything to Vajrasattva is to relax, actually, right? And so in other words, you're saying, I'm letting go of all my attachment, aversion, and ignorance. I offer all the objects of my attachment, aversion, and ignorance to you, Vajrasattva. So we're relaxing our attachment, our anger, our grasping. So it's feeling a sense of like letting everything go and offering it all to Vajrasattva. So that we're just like kind of simple and present. Then we have nothing to worry about, actually. We've offered the whole universe to Vajrasattva, so we have nothing to worry about. Except our own mind, our own karma. So now let's read together the 2 verses for the power, prayer of the opponent power of regret and refuge, and then we'll meditate on that. So through ignorance and delusion, I have broken and damaged my pledges. Holy Guru, who has the power to liberate me, my inner master, holder of the Vajra, whose essence is great compassion, Lord of migratory genies, to you I go for refuge. Bhagavan Vajrasattva, destroyer of all defilements, who has attained to all realizations, and has passed to the other shore, I request you to please purify all negativities and broken and damaged pledges of myself and others and me. So this is the important part right now, another important part. So we have to pause here. And actually this is like this part is where you have to put effort in, right? So you have to think for yourself, actually, of particular negative actions. Right? You could think of any you've done in your life, in past lives, but then, or particularly if there's something either that you have intense regret about, or that you have a habit of doing, or that you've done this week. You have to think, right? Let's try to be, like we talked about earlier, try to be specific. And think of a certain pattern, a certain kind of behavior, certain examples. And then you have to generate intelligent regret, right? You have to have some analysis. So you have to, again, first be specific, right, about either a specific behavior or a specific kind of behavior or pattern. Then you have to analyze very honestly and with effort, right, or is really, trying to focus on how does that cause suffering? How does it cause you suffering? How does it cause others suffering? What are the short-term suffering consequences and what are the long-term suffering? Check up as you think about it. Like as you're doing that action, right, that's negative, how does it make you really feel about yourself? There's so many kinds of suffering, that's one. Right? If you check in your heart, you don't feel good about yourself when you're doing it. But check for yourself, specifically, how does that make you feel? How does it make you feel about yourself when you're doing it? And then when you look back on yourself doing it, how do you feel about yourself? How does it affect your emotions? How does it affect your contentment? Your happiness, your well-being, your self-image? What direct harm does it give others? What indirect harm does it give others? Does it in any way obstruct your spiritual or psychological or inner development and growth? The action is something that you're like attached to doing or habituate to doing, you may notice your mind like wanting to pull away, not wanting to really think deeply, not wanting to really accept, your own analysis. Sometimes your mind will try to distract you. Sometimes your mind might make excuses to yourself. Rationalizing. But so you're allowed to. This is not like a moral police or something, but just try to really be honest with yourself. Right? That's the goal here. So if you catch your mind doing that, just like notice it and say, why am I doing that? You know, is it because I really think the action's good, or am I rationalizing? And continue to try to be deeply honest with yourself about whether these particular action, one or two pattern of actions, whatever you're doing, whether they lead to happiness or suffering, how they make you feel about yourself, how they impact others, if they cause you suffering when you're doing them or after you're doing them, if they cause suffering to others while you're doing them or after you're doing them. If your mind tries to jump away, just notice that. But then continue analyzing. You know, just be honest, ask yourself, well, okay, what's going on? How do I really relate to that pattern of action? What does it do to me? What does it do to others? Continue cobbling for a few more minutes. Remember, so the definition of a negative action, of a negative karmic action, is that which leads to suffering. So keep contemplating until you decide for yourself. Right? If the action that you're contemplating, the actions you're thinking of, are negative in that sense, and until you generate a real feeling, as much as you're capable, of like regret, intelligent regret, aversion to that action. some cases you can also think about how it impacts society. So whichever level, there are different ways how it impacts you in this life, how it impacts you in future lives, how it impacts you while you're doing it, how it impacts you after, how it impacts your self-image, your feelings about yourself, future rebirths, and also how it influences, how you're doing that influences your country, the world. So you can think from many different angles. For those who were here in those particular classes or read about it, right, there's also the different kinds of results. So like what kind of rebirth does it lead to? What kind of environmental results? What kinds of experiences similar to the cause? And then the worst of all, right, the habit of doing that action again and again endlessly in samsara, without end. If you don't break the pattern in this life, it just goes on and on throughout infinite future lives, and like an endless cycle. Because this is your chance, right, to break the pattern when you have this kind of human life with special liberties and freedoms, and knowledge and abilities. You won't always have this kind of opportunity to change. Like by thinking to put off changing yourself for the better is the ultimate way of cheating yourself. It's actually the ultimate form of lack of self-compassion. you think about the power of intelligent regret as you do the mantra, as we said earlier, right? But so now we'll just, so you think, with whatever level of intelligent regret you've generated, again turn your attention to Vajrasattva and your crown, thinking that you're doing, again, all these practices for the benefit of others, cherishing others from your heart, have compassion, you're trying to regress to enlightenment and therefore purify negative karma and transform yourself into someone more and more helpful, more and more wise, more compassionate. So with that motivation, you pray to Vajrasattva, right, to help you transform yourself, to realize to actualize your own, or awaken your own Buddha nature. So due to that request, light rays radiate from the mantra rosary, right? So remember, the mantra is the 100-syllable mantra is counterclockwise around the hum on a moon cushion at Vajrasattva's heart. So the hum and the mantra radiate light everywhere, purifying all the negativities and obscurations of all sentient beings, including you, right? So those light rays hit everyone. They make offerings to all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So in the perfect qualities of all the holy body, speech, and mind of all the and all their wisdom return of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, return and sink into or dissolve into the hum and the mantra rosary at Vajrasattva's heart. So now you're going to visualize, right, like we said earlier, that from the mantra rosary at the heart. Now you're visualizing. Remember that if you want to just visualize Vajrasattva solitary, that's okay, or you can visualize male and female, but you're imagining now that at each of their hearts, if you have both, from the mantra rosary and the hum at each of their hearts, light, like light rays, white light and white nectar start pouring down through their body into you. And so they're made of light, but then a kind of even more brilliant white light flows down through your crown and through your through the center of your body, the central channel, and then just spreading throughout your entire body. It's kind of a blissful white nectar. That's in the nature of transcendental wisdom, of great bliss and transcendental wisdom. And so it purifies all negative actions and defilements of your body, speech, and mind. So it purifies all negative karma, all imprints, all tendencies towards negative actions, disease, everything negative, right? And so you can imagine that as you visualize, right, I already gave some visualizations, right? So you can think of Vajrasattva on your crown, you can think of your negative actions and imagine them being washed out. And if you want to imagine them being washed out, there are three ways. You can imagine them being washed out downward through your body, like pouring down and washing out through the bottom of your body. Or you can imagine like a cup that your body gets filled with that nectar and it pours out the top. Or you can imagine that light nectar comes to your crown and then just immediately all the negativities disappear the way darkness disappears when you turn on light in the dark room. And so you can do any of those visualizations. And so now let's, like for a while, just you can visualize any of those things that we talked about, or think about any of those things we talked about. As you're combining now meditation while reciting the mantra. At the beginning, if it's unfamiliar, it'd be hard to do both, but you can just be flexible and see. And so again, you can recite it either way. Right? So I'm going to do it once. We can recite it together once. Actually, let's just do it this way. Om Vajra Haruka Samaya Mano Palaya Haruka Deno Papita Dedo Megawa Sutokyo Megawa Supokyo Megawa Anurako Megawa Sarva Siddhi Me Prayatsa Sarva Karma Sujame Shum Shayam Guru Hum Ha 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 Ho Bhagavan Vajra Haruka Nanancha Haruka Bhawa Mahasamaya Sattva Ha Hum Te. So just recite that, for a while doing any of those thoughts and visualizations. for each one, like, make some kind of a resolve or a resolution. As it says there for 1 day, 1 hour, 1 minute, or at least a few seconds, not to do that action. So anybody can do that one, right? But try with each one to be specific. So let's take a couple minutes and actually think and be specific, and make like a commitment. Actually, try experiment with this. Try making it like a resolution, but also like a commitment, even if it's for a few seconds, to yourself and to Vajrasattva, visualized on your crown, who represents your, you know, in some sense your guru, but also your own purity. So as you're making this like resolve, right? This resolve not to repeat the action even for 1 minute, you think that Vajrasattva and his consort are very happy with that. So they both dissolve into light. They dissolve into the crown of your head. Dissolve, and and your mind becomes inseparable, right? Like mixed like water mixed with water. So your mind becomes inseparable from the pristine purity of Guru Vajrasattva, from his compassion, and their compassion. It's also both male and female. See, from their wisdom, their compassion, their purity. And so your body, your speech, and your mind are pristine and pure. And you enjoy the bliss of emptiness, the bliss conjoined with emptiness, like non-dualistically. And so there you actually think for a moment about emptiness, and that there is no, actually although it appears independent, right? The self appears independent, the action appears independent, right? The doer and the deed, that actually there is no independent. Right? The doer of a deed is dependent upon the deed. Right? So that appearance of truly existent independent self and independent actions is an illusion. They're actually interdependent or dependently arisen. So the independent self, independent actions that you saw yourself engaging in were actually like done with a dualistic mind grasping at true existence. It was all kind of like a dream, like an illusion. Recognize there is no independent, inherently existing, solid self or other or action. I think it's just interdependent and dependently arisen. So then while being aware of that, we'll just together, we can do these few dedication verses, starting on page 19. Because of this merit, may I quickly become Haruka Vajrasattva and lead each and every sentient being into his divine enlightened realm. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow, and that which no decline, but increase. Then you can do your own, dedications, right, to be a benefit to others, and to achieve every type of wisdom, compassion, skill, to be of ultimate use to others. So I want to suggest that we do, just meditate. So we'll do one more Vajrasattva session later. But I would suggest that before we take another break, that we do an activity. Like usually with these classes, we do some interactive activity. I think it's good to do. So what I'd like to suggest is this: is to break in a minute, to break up into small groups of like 3, let's say roughly around 3 people. And what I want to suggest is doing this: is to share with each other your own reflections on regret. Right. So to share experientially. Like what, give some examples of negative actions that you see yourself doing, and then share your own insights about why regret them. Like in other words, what do you see as how they lead to suffering? Because this actually, this is how we help each other, right? We're helping each other meditate. I actually want to say something too, because since meditation is training your mind, actually, this kind of discussion is meditation in a sense. It's a contemplative meditation together, but it's just an interactive one, right? So, and it's sort of, a lot of times by hearing somebody else's reflections, then it helps you see yourself more clearly, right? So that's the purpose of this. So let's break up into small group. If you do too big a group, then not everybody gets to talk much. So we do a fairly small group. But I just want to say also, like, obviously if something's very private, it's up to you, but try to be honest.
Non-virtuous speech, angry words, words that hurt.
Overview.
Well,
Yeah.
you guys covered all the main ones then.
We covered all the main ones, but
That one. Yeah,
when we got down deeper, it all has the same root. What's the root?
self-cherishing.
Self-cherishing.
Self-cherishing. Yeah. So that was interesting. It felt different on up here, but down deep it was.
Yeah. And that's really the teaching of Buddhist psychology, right? That, like, actually, like if you look at the teachings in Buddha, the teaching of the Buddha, the teaching of Buddhist psychology is that actually the deepest root is ignorance, grasping at an independent or truly existent self. Then from that comes self-cherishing. And then what they say is that from that, all the other, 84,000 different delusions elaborate out from that. And so, like, sometimes they even say, right, like that, if you look at it from, like, the causal point of view, it's self-grasping, ignorance, self-cherishing, and then all the delusions. And then sometimes they talk about, so in the process of getting enlightened, you have to eliminate all 84,000 delusions. So what they usually say is you have to start with your most intense ones, but eventually you have to get back, right, and destroy. You'll never ultimately be liberated if you can't destroy those too. And sometimes they say it's like one metaphor they sometimes use is that self-grasping, right, ignorance, is like the king of the enemy, and self-cherishing is the general or the secretary of defense or something who protects that king. And if you want to become enlightened, you have to destroy both of them. Actually, that's the process of becoming. And then and if you cut those, then all the other delusions naturally subside, like you're hinting at. Yeah.
Yes.
So I guess the trick is, if you think about this process, right? It's like, and this again, it's that what we were talking about earlier, that realisticness, being realistic with yourself is like, in other words, am I capable of getting at the king or the minister, or do I have to first fight against, some minor, some minor, whatever, like what do you call this, like a grunt on the front line or something? I don't know. Like, do I have to fight against some, like, because I'm not yet capable of getting to there? But eventually we have to get there, But we have to start wherever we are and then keep going. Yeah. But you can always trace it back, exactly.
What would you say about like I think we've talked about this some before, but like self-hatred, like that kind of thing, because I don't know. I think it's from I'll just speak for myself. You know, I think a lot of my lack of cherishing others is like pretty much what I'm trying to say is most of my like I have the same things, but they seem to like instead of taking maybe a more common route, they detour through some kind of like prism of self-hatred or like you know this like thing, which is this constant self, just like you know it's a self-cherishing thing. But would if that's the case, would meditating on compassion for yourself be a good idea, or is that reinforcing self-cherishing? Because it almost feels like my ego, like the ego, there's like an ego and like a self, which I mean, there isn't like you know I understand it's not like a true self, but this is kind of how it manifests, you know, and then it's almost like constantly attacking this other of self.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is so clearly, you know, self-hatred is a form of hatred, right? So it's the same, you know, and there's that definitely you can purify, right? But I think it's you know that particular right? If it's self-hatred, then it's a form of hatred. So that's one of the three root delusions. So I guess one thing is like, I guess in my view, a couple things. I mean, there are many, you know, of course, there are many approaches to that, but so it's not hard to see it's not hard to generate the regret, right? Because it's easy to see the faults of it. At least that's it. That's one good thing about self-hatred is any kind of hatred is it's not that hard to see the faults of it. But I think though that like, I think there are tons of different meditations one can do to counteract that. But what would seem that like you know, the one we were talking about earlier, like the meditation on Buddha nature, or the meditation on the clarity, you know, like the clarity of your own mind, and then also your Buddha nature and the emptiness of your own mind, which is actually the real Buddha nature is the emptiness of your own mind. Actually, that's the ultimate meaning of Buddha nature. But actually, to contemplate that.
Clear light nature, or is that something different?
It can be called that. The clear light has different meanings and different. Clear light has different meaning in different contexts.
Okay.
But sometimes clear light can mean emptiness, actually, and sometimes clear light can mean in tantra it means something slightly different. So it depends. It depends on the context. But sometimes, like in the Perfection of Wisdom sutras, sometimes they'll call clear light emptiness as a synonym. Yeah. But because if you meditate on that, or like on that point in the Vajrasattva sadhana that we did, right, when the guru absorbs into you, and then you think my body, speech, and mind are totally inseparable. I mean, that's a direct antidote to thinking negatively about oneself. So I think that's it'd be interesting to experiment with things like that, since it's there in the Vajrasattva. And actually be interesting, right, to see like if you could do, you know how it says like in the sadhana, right, it says seconds. This is how many days, hours, minutes, or seconds. Like, but actually, like that would be one. Like if a person is really chronically thinking that way, right, then it's possible, right, to go, okay, so I'm going to time it. You know, I'm going to literally take my watch, right, and okay, for like 30 seconds, I'm going to see if I can stay in a state of like, even if the thought starts to rise, I'm going to cut it before it actually arises for 30 seconds, and I'll say I'm going to meditate on being oneness with Vajrasattva's holy body, speech, and mind, and to like get through 30 seconds and then get to 45. That's literally where you can do that. Actually, I mean, that's not totally metaphorical. Actually, when they say seconds, you can literally go, okay, now I'm going to do 45 seconds. Can I get to a minute eventually? Like, how long would it take to get to 6 minutes, or something like that? Like, one can do that, but then slowly it becomes like, and what starts to happen, of course, if you can do it for 7 minutes, let's say eventually, well then it starts to kick in when you're not doing it intentionally, because if you did that regularly, like where it starts to kick in for like, but again, like the Dalai Lama often emphasizes, we have to be like, step by, like in other words, because that seems realistic, right? Like anybody could do that for 30 seconds. Like for 30 seconds, you can't say the thought's not going to rise, but you can say, you know what, for 30 seconds, even if the thought starts to arise, I can say, I can meditate like that. But so the Dalai Lama often points out, he says, well, so then, if you can do 30 seconds, eventually you can do a minute. If you can do a minute, you can do a minute and a half. And slowly, and then you can see how over the course of, and this is what the Dalai Lama is often emphasizing, you have to take a long-term view, right? So you can say, well, if I keep increasing by, how long would it take? If I keep increasing by a minute, or 2 minutes a week, how long would it take until, well, actually that's not that long, right? After 52 weeks, that's a lot, like suddenly, wow, that's a long time, actually. So it'd be interesting. I'm just saying, like, there are ways to experiment, but one has to, in Buddhist training, it really, there's a real emphasis on that, on consistency and effort, and just sort of very slowly increasing, But then, like, that's what God always says oftentimes. Is then he says, then you can look back a year later and say, wow, look at that. Whereas if you don't do that kind of step by step, then a year later, sometimes you look and you go, well, am I different? Am I not different? I'm not really sure. Like, you know, so if you don't set the specific goals like that, then it's just, sometimes you get lucky and you just can see a change, but it's harder to be sure. But if you say, okay, I could do a minute, I could do 2 minutes, I could do 3, you know, at the beginning you could say, well, that doesn't seem very advanced. Somebody else is doing some, you know, I don't know, something, whatever. But actually it doesn't matter what some, you know, like in other words, like, to me that's like real Buddhist training actually, is like, and you know, like if you think of that guy, right, the famous, now he's famous, right, but he was doing little pebbles, right, like, in one way it's like, oh gosh, you know, like, yesterday I had, you know, 50 pebbles, now I have 49, it doesn't seem that, then it goes back to 51, like, you know, but clearly over time he was changing, you know, and I think they tell his story because it's like he's so practical, actually, right, you know, it's like, you know, it wouldn't seem that impressive when you said, oh, you know, over this year I'm doing like 5 less pebbles a day on average. But then if you know, over 10 years that becomes the whole thing, you know, the whole pile or something.
What does it mean, if you could really dumb this down, what does it mean when you say you've purified your karma? What does that mean?
Let's see. So there are different interpretations. So first of all, different levels of that or something. But I think the easiest, the best, okay, so to answer it, to dumb it down and answer it clearly, it's like this. The analogy that's often given is, like this time of year there are acorns falling, right, in the yard, you know. So that acorn can eventually ripen, right, it could become an oak tree, let's say, right. But if I put that acorn in the oven, and I turn the oven up to 475 degrees, and I leave it in there, then it's gonna reach a point where it'll burn, right? Or I throw it in a fire, for example, and then it can't ever ripen. It's still a seed, right? It's still, if you look at it, it could still look like an acorn, but it reaches a point where that acorn can never become an oak tree because it was the material inside it was destroyed by the heat, right? So it's similar. That's all. Like, so it means, you know, it doesn't, like, if you think of an action, right, like you still did the action. You can't destroy the fact that you've done, you know, if I got angry at somebody and yelled at them before,
Right.
I can't destroy the fact that I got angry at them and yelled at them. That happened. So, but what can happen is is like the seed that's burnt. In other words, it can't, you know, through this kind of process, through this, this training, right, or this kind of process of purification, you change your relationship to that karma such that it can't ripen. And it won't be able to ripen. So that's really what you're doing.
You change your relationship to it.
Yeah, I would say that. Like, that you do some other action, right? Like, so in other words, you did that action, right? So you can't, like, what I'm getting at is like the example, right? I yelled at somebody. So I can't go back in time and change that. There's no way in the world, right? It's impossible, because it's in the past. But what I can do is by doing this process of purification, yeah, I can change my relationship to that past event such that that won't ripen into any kind of negative experience in the future. That's really what. Does that answer it? Like, does
I
that
mean,
make
it
sense?
gets me a step closer.
Yeah.
You know, because, you know, I think in the end, there may be a temptation on my part to worry about now the karmic repercussions of my past deeds. And I don't think that's what this is about.
No.
I don't think we can, but I'd just like to hear what you have to say about that. We're not to concern ourselves with how our karma might be ripening. And even if it does ripen, I read, you know, something that said, if your karma ripens, you should embrace that. You should say,
Yep.
I'm now able to close this debt, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's like, yeah, I remember one time, Reaper Rinpoche said to me, something like, one time he said, well, we're Dharma practitioners, so we don't care if our bad karma ripens. We're happy, you know, we're happy if bad karma ripens. And I remember like having a slight hesitation, like my self-cherishing went, oh, I don't, like, there was a little self-cherishing thought, like, oh, I don't really, you know, like just a naturally spontaneous moment of not really wanting something bad to happen. But then realizing, like, he was giving me a teach, you know, he knew that he knew that he had overcome self-cherishing, and I wasn't quite there yet. But he was pointing out that, he was pointing out that point, right? Like, in other words, that Dharma practitioners don't worry about that. Dharma practitioners worry about what they're doing now, creating the causes for the future. They don't worry about what's ripening from the past, right? Because actually, you can control what you purify, but you can't control what ripens, actually, right?
Well, wait, hold on. You've gotten very. This is not a simple answer you're giving now. Are you saying? Could you just explain? Are you saying that are we purifying for the future, or are we purifying for things we've done in the past?
Oh no, for sure we're purifying things we've done in the past, but I guess what I'm getting at there is, but you can't control, like you can do a lot. It's very good to do a lot of purification practice, but still, like you can't guarantee, right? Like a Buddha can see the subtleties of karma, but a normal person, if they're purifying, right, they can't say, well, I'm going to purify all the causes of any financial problems, then I'll never have a financial problem, right? Like you can't know that, right? And so what he was getting at there is that Dharma practitioners don't worry if they have financial problems or not. Then, right?
What do they do? If hardship strikes, what is the way to approach the hardship?
The best practice of all, I believe, is tonglen, right? So in other words, like if you have hardships of financial problems, then you recognize, well, everybody, like countless beings throughout time and space have financial problems. May their problems ripen on my self-cherishing, my good karma ripen on them. If diseases happen, may the others, countless others also suffer from disease and suffer and all kinds of physical suffering. Actually, it's one of the very nature of being in samsara is that we get sick. Right? I'm just giving you examples. All these problems come, whereas these are just the nature of being alive and unenlightened. So then you practice taking and giving, tonglen. There's no better practice than that, in my opinion. Would be, so whatever happens, right, you just practice tonglen. So, and there's a verse, right, there are many verses like this, but it says, one verse that Ken Rinpoche taught was something like, if I'm happy, right, if happy circumstances come, or if I'm happy, may I share my happiness with all sentient beings. If suffering circumstances come, may the suffering of all beings, also ripen. May it be a cause for taking the suffering of all sentient beings upon myself, cherishing, and for liberating them from suffering. Right. So to me that verse is expressing the attitude of a bodhisattva.
So when we take on the suffering of others, is the motivation behind that to liberate them from suffering? So I should suffer instead of them. Am I getting this right? Because these are subtleties that I've never fully understood.
Yeah, it's tricky in a way because, for sure, the motivation is to free others from suffering, right? But it's a little tricky because it's definitely not masochistic. In other words, there's not like a thing of may I always suffer, may I keep suffering, may I be miserable. It's not that. In other words, but it's like I think the right way to say it is this: is like, if you look at it's like this. If you look at a loving parent, right, if you look at like a loving mom when their child is sick, right, like. First of all, especially I watch if you watch a mom with a little baby, right, where they absolutely adore the baby, right, and the baby has snot, right, and the mom's wiping it off with their hands, right. All the time I go, wow, because I'm not a mom,
Is that gross? Is that what you think?
It gets me a little bit like, oh wow, wow, how kind though, so much love and so much sense of cherishing that there's no hesitation, right. And there's no feeling of, I might get sick. You can see, you can see on the face, right? I was watching my sister, for example, with her baby. It's like, wow, there's no, the baby's sick, right? And she's so happy to take care of it. And actually, if on the one hand, she doesn't want to get sick, right? But there's a feeling, if I could take that sickness, if I could have it on myself and not on her, I'd be so happy. The mom feels, the feeling is that the mom doesn't want to be sick, but the feeling is if I could take that away, if it could be me rather than him or her, I'd be so happy for it to be that way. So it's like an attitude where, to me, that captures the feeling, though. It's not that the person wants to be sick, right? But it's that they so cherish the other, they'd rather it be on... The feeling is, I'd rather have it be on me than them. But that's an emotional feeling, it's not a wish to be sick. Do you see the difference there?
But what if I don't want that? That's the problem. I won't delay you any further.
No.
But I don't want to be sick on behalf of someone else. Is that self-cherishing?
Probably, yeah, yeah. It is. And so again, like, but the thing is not to blame oneself or to say something, but it's to cultivate the feeling of charity. Whereas you can't, like, if you say, well, I shouldn't care about being sick, that's the wrong training. I think the right way to train is to train in the feeling of cherishing the others and let it grow organically.
I see.
You know, so to me, that's the key, I think. Because if you say, well, you know, that's bad, I shouldn't be that way, I don't think, personally, I don't think that helps that much. It seems more helpful if one focuses on, like, if one meditates over and over again on the preciousness of others, on how they so want to be happy, on how they so don't want to suffer, on how they're so precious, and how they're so kind, on how they're so important. You know, like, that they're, what's the word? They have their own subjectivity, and they're equally important to any other being. You know, this and this sort of ongoing process, and think about how one's interdependence with them and their interdependence with others, and if you think that way many, many times over and over again, and you train yourself, then the feeling of cherishing others increases over time.
I see.
And then I think, you know, and then the other stuff happens as it happens. You know, like, but I think the key is to train in the cherishing part.
I see.
Well, I don't just think that, that's what the teachings say, you know. And there are so many mental trainings of how to train your mind to cherish others. Like cherishing, first you train in equalizing with others, and then in exchanging with others. And there are many contemplations for that, but they're in the books and all that. But I mean, so I think that's the key, though, is you train in the cherishing of others, and then the rest of it just happens.
Okay, you helped me refocus this. Thank you. I understand now better what it's about.
Yeah, so any other questions about the purification, or comments about the purification process? So, so what I was thinking to do is a couple of things. One is to do a little more Vajrasattva, do one more session of Vajrasattva practice. But then I also had another idea, and I tried to print out, my printer is almost out of ink, so it didn't come clear. But we could do this too, is, so because I just thought, I had this idea, so Lama Zopa Rinpoche often, if there's like he actually, I'll say this, when he was here one time in Washington, he said, he was saying to me, oh, like when storms are coming, like it was after Hurricane Katrina, you know, so Lama Zopa Rinpoche said, oh, when storms are coming, or when like a terrorist problem, or some other big problem's coming, it would be good if the beings in that place could gather. He was giving an example of Hurricane Katrina. He said if they could stand on the edge of the bay, what's it called? It's not a bay there, it's the Gulf of Mexico. You know, but if they could stand there and sort of meditate on bodhicitta and then recite some prayer or some mantra, that'd be really good. You know, like he was saying like that. And I remember he said like 2 times to me, and then I thought, he said, if you know something bad's gonna happen, then it's good if you can do that. And then I was thinking about it, and I thought, well, why did he say that to me twice? And I was like, well, maybe he's talking about DC, you know, like a lot of bad things can happen. So then I said to him, well, should we do that here? And he said, yeah, when you can, that's good. So I thought that since there's like a storm coming and things, maybe it'd be good if we recite, there's a particular mantra of the Earth Store Bodhisattva, or the Earth Essence Bodhisattva, that's supposed to be beneficial for natural. So if you meditate on bodhicitta, then you recite that, it's supposed to help some way, right? So I thought we could do that briefly together also, just like to benefit to, you know, whether the force of our bodhicitta is strong enough to do anything or not, I don't know. But it's mainly the motivation that seems, but we could try, you know, like, in other words, there's still a good motivation, so it can't hurt. So we can, I just printed out the short mantra, so maybe we can write it down and then recite. But would you rather do the Vajrasattva first or that first?
Your mantra.
Do that one first? And then,
Yeah.
okay, so I'll tell you the mantra, you can write it down, or I can give these out, but they're not very clear is the problem. But it's a short mantra, so it's, I'll wait and see how stable it is.
It's the Earth Bodhisattva one?
Yeah, his name is, in Sanskrit, his name is Kshiti Garba.
Pen.
Sure.
But, so that name means, I think Kshiti is like earth, and Garba, I think they translate it as essence, or something like that. So sometimes they translate his name Earth Essence Bodhisattva. He's usually like kind of depicted as, they have a statue of him out at Land of Medicine Buddha, a really big, like double, triple life-size statue of him. But so he said he has a lot of different qualities, but one of them is kind of protecting the earth or something, right? You know, like and protecting from natural disasters. But okay, so his mantra is first syllable is Om. Second syllable is Ah. Then then comes his name. So the first part of his name is Kshiti, K S-H-I-T-I.
Say that again, sorry.
So the first half of his name is Kshiti, so it's K-S-H-I-T-I. That means earth in Sanskrit. And then the second part of his name, which means I think essence, or something like that, is Garba. So G-A-R-B-H-A is usually how that's spelled. So far we have Om A Shidi Garba. Then the next word is in Sanskrit it's aspirated, so it's Ta-leng. So T-H, but not the, it's Ta, like T-H-A. You know what I mean? So in Sanskrit that would not be tha, it would be ta. And then the second half of that word is leng, L-E-N-G. And then the last syllable of the mantra is hum, H-U-M, like we were doing earlier when we visualized the hum.
What does hum mean again?
Hum is a syllable. It doesn't have a real meaning. It's a syllable that's often like the sometimes it symbolizes just like the essence of a deity or something like that. And sometimes sometimes it's used to end the mantra. It has different content. It can also mean sometimes it doesn't really mean, but it signifies the pure aspect of the mind. That's sometimes associated with that. But so maybe since we start with that, why don't we do that? So let's do a meditation, right? So first, the main thing is to generate compassion and bodhicitta. So in particular, we can think of actually we can think of like in the whole, actually, right, because I saw some diagram, right, so that storm is like, looked like from like North Carolina or South Carolina all the way up through New England, right, through New Jersey, New York, and New England. So we can think of like there's so many human beings, right, and then so many animals, right, non-human beings in that region, right, like millions actually, right? Between the humans and the non-humans, many, many, many millions and millions and millions. Because if you include like ants, and insects, and birds, and actually like the animals are even more vulnerable than the human beings. Right? Human beings are vulnerable, right, to floods and power outages and drowning, and things falling on them and so on. But then like so many animals, they have like absolutely no protection at all. So if like, actually imagine being a bird outside in a hurricane. Right? Your body's designed actually to be like moved by wind, and then you're stuck in like extremely powerful winds with no shelter, right? There's no birdhouse, there's no indoors, there's no place to go. And then like if you're a bird, right, maybe in other season you can hide behind some leaves. And this time of year the leaves are blowing away. So the bird will try to go behind the leaves, and the leaves will blow off. So just giving you an example, right? And then like animals that are under the earth, right, then their place floods. And for us it's like an inconvenience if our basement floods. But if you're an animal that lives under the earth, it's not just an inconvenience, right? You drown. So you're just like imagining, right, all the sufferings, right? Of course, then like people who are in vulnerable spots and so on. It's very obvious from watching the news. So the idea is to just generate a sense of compassion, right, for all those beings who are vulnerable. And then one generates the bodhicitta thought is, my ultimate motivation is to become fully enlightened in order to liberate all those beings, not just from the temporary suffering of some like a hurricane or storm, right? My ultimate purpose is bigger than that. I'd like to become fully enlightened and lead all of them to enlightenment. Like guide them to every kind of guide them along a path where they gain wisdom, compassion, meditative, deep meditation, and become utterly liberated from ignorance and suffering, all the delusions, become fully enlightened, right? So my ultimate purpose would be to become fully enlightened, to benefit all those sentient beings, to lead them to full enlightenment, permanent liberation from suffering. But then in the meantime, in this, in this particular time and place and week, at least my wish is to at least protect them, like from fear, from cold, from water, from wind, from all the suffering that comes in relationship to the elements when a storm comes. And so almost like generating a feeling, right, towards all those humans and animals and, non-human beings, almost like a feeling like a parent, right, who wants to protect their child. Right, if you imagine like a caring parent whose child was like out, caught someplace vulnerable in a hurricane, right, they would desperately want to protect them. So generating a feeling like that of cherishing others. Just use the example of a parent like for cherishing, right? That we generate a feeling of cherishing those others and wanting to protect them from all the sufferings of samsara, and then in particular right now from the sufferings of the elements, right, in relation to a storm. So generating a real, like, as much feeling as you can of cherishing those others, of loving kindness and compassion, wanting to protect, feeling that they're precious and vulnerable. And that, like, you're interdependent with them. That their happiness depends on you, and your happiness depends on them. Just like family. So then with the motivation, ultimately, right, to lead them all to enlightenment, then temporarily to protect them from suffering this week. And then, like, together we can actually imagine the earth stork, Kshitigarbha Bodhisattva. We can imagine him like here, but like we can also imagine him like on the coast. Like radiating light rays pacifying the elements so that they're not so extreme, don't harm others. And we can recite his mantra while meditating on compassion and imagining him kind of radiating light rays through this whole eastern seaboard, protecting all beings. Well, just like maybe for 10 minutes we can recite his mantra while meditating like that. Okay, so remember it's Om Am Kshitigarbha Kalan Hum.